Semua dimulai dari sebuah pertanyaan, juga rasa penasaran tentang masa depan. Mengapa jarak dan waktu harus menjadi halangan? Mengapa punya mimpi jika tidak kita wujudkan? Mengapa harus sabar menunggu giliran untuk meraih masa depan yang kita inginkan? Dan untuk Telkomsel, mengapa harus berhenti jika masih banyak yang mungkin diraih? Dengan transformasi kultur digital perusahaan yang menggerakkan kami, mengapa menjadi satu kata yang tidak bisa disepelekan? Sebuah pertanyaan yang menyimpan kekuatan. Mengapa mampu merobohkan tembok halangan? Mengapa mampu membangun jembatan yang menyambungkan seluruh Indonesia, menembus batas negara, membawa kami menjadi digital telco kelas dunia? Di saat semua masih bertanya tentang masa depan, kami telah membuka jalan dan buktikan kalau meraih masa depan itu semudah menyentuh dengan jari tangan. Apapun yang kamu inginkan, kami wujudkan semuanya dalam genggaman. Karena kami adalah masa depan. Selalu bergerak untuk menjadi solusi gaya hidup digital mobile kelas dunia. Memberi layanan melalui konektivitas digital tanpa batas dengan teknologi terdepan yang melebihi ekspektasi pelanggan. Kami berkomitmen untuk membangun sebuah semesta di mana semua pintu peluang terbuka. Peluang untuk jelajahi setiap dunia barunya, peluang untuk semakin bebas berkreasi dan juga berekspresi, peluang untuk hadirkan diri lebih jauh dan sampaikan suara kepada dunia, peluang untuk menang, peluang untuk jadi lebih berkelas, peluang untuk bebas menentukan pilihan, mau bertabur bintang atau mau mencari ketenangan, peluang untuk ciptakan nilai lebih bagi para inisiator, menjadi digital powerhouse yang memperkuat pertumbuhan ekonomi Indonesia, peluang untuk melebarkan sayap, berkembang bersama, peluang untuk bisa lebih berkarya bagi nusa dan bangsa. Bersama-sama, kami hidupkan masa depan yang diimpikan. Buka semua peluang dan wujudkan potensi tak terbatas dengan Telkomsel. Mengapa tidak? Telkomsel, buka semua peluang.
Ladies and gentlemen, greetings. Welcome to GoSouth 2022 Annual Convention on the Global South, presented to you by Institute of International Studies, Department of International Relations, Universitas Gadjah Mada. My name is Ray Karis, and it is my honor to be able to become your Master of Ceremony for today's convention. To introduce our event today, GoSouth 2022 is an annual convention held routinely by Institute of International Studies, Universitas Gadjah Mada, established under the name Bandung Beyond Conference back in 2015. Changing its name into Annual Convention on the Global South in 2019, Global South is the pioneer of Global South Politics Conference in Indonesia, and to this day still stands as the one and only conference of Global South politics of the country. For the year 2022 itself, Go South is held on 13th to 15th September as part of UGM's Faculty of Social and Political Sciences 67th Dies Natalis. Please announce that this year's Go South is being supported by Telkomsel, Indonesia's leading digital telecommunication service, Buka Semua Peluang. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, welcome to Go South 2022 Annual Convention on the Global South, presented to you by Institute of International Studies, supported by Telkomsel, #Buka Semua Peluang. To start off our event, we call upon Dr. Nur Rahmat Yulianto, Magister of Arts in International Relations, Head of Universitas Gadjah Mada's Department of IR, to share his welcoming remarks. Dr. Rahmat, time and place is yours.
Thank you, Ray. Good afternoon. Distinguished presenters and discussants, distinguished guests, I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the annual convention on the Global South 2022. The theme, Transcending the North-South Divide, G20 and Multilateralism in Turbulent Global Politics. The convention also marks the start of a series of events to commemorate the 67th anniversary of the Faculty of Social and Political Sciences, Universitas Gadjah Mada. The rise of so-called emerging powers from the Global South, such as Indonesia, Brazil, China, and India, have sparked the hope that post-colonial countries are able to expand their influence in the international order. The international order would no longer be dominated by countries in the global North. Instead, Global South countries would equally participate in deciding how key international issues are governed. With this in mind, it is expected that the global governance would become more attentive to the interests of vulnerable individuals in the Southern Hemisphere. However, it remains a question whether the participation of Global South powers in the global governance succeeds in fostering global solidarity to protect the vulnerable in the Global South. Other questions include has the leadership of certain countries in forums like the G20 or BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, sufficiently effective to address power and resource asymmetry between the Global South and the Global North? What can be done to overcome the gap between the Global South and the Global North, especially amidst the growing pressure of global problems such as digital transformation, energy transition, and the global pandemics? So it is within this context that the Institute of International Studies, Department of International Relations, Universitas Gadjah Mada organizes this conference. It is designed to offer an academic, practical, and policy-oriented platform to exchange views and ideas on formulating strategies that can enable the Global South to overcome the North-South divide through their participation in the G20 and other multilateral schemes in a time of polarized global politics. This conference can generate a variety of ideas of initiatives and policies in light of empowering the Global South in making a more just, peaceful, and civilized global society. Thank you.
Thank Dr. Rahmat for the very warm opening, and with all being said, GoSouth 2022 has officially started. Participants may send reactions on the box or through Zoom reaction options. Thank you very much. Up next, we will start GoSouth 2022 with our keynote lecture session, introducing Dr. Poppy Sulistianing Winanti as the convener of GoSouth 2022 and also chair of keynote lecture session. Okay. Dr. Poppy Sulistianing Winanti is a senior lecturer at the Department of International Relations in Universitas Gadjah Mada, currently serving as the Vice Dean of Academics and Students Affairs of the Faculty of Social and Political Sciences, Universitas Gadjah Mada, and her areas of expertise include Indonesia's economic diplomacy, South-South cooperation, the WTO and the future of global trade regime, regional economic integration, governance in extractive industries, conflict and political economy of natural resources, and also resource nationalism. Dr. Pepi, you may now have the floor.
Thank you, Ray. Distinguished guests, speakers, panelists, participants of the GoSouth 2022 Annual Convention on the Global South. Good afternoon from Yogyakarta, Indonesia. On behalf of the conference conveners, myself, Poppy S. Winanti, Dr. Lukmanul Hakim, the Director of the Institute of International Studies, and Rizky Alif Alfian, lecturer of the Department of International Relations, I would like to welcome everyone to the keynote lecture session with Dr. Sarifah Munirah Alatas. This year's convention is the fourth convention, which was initiated in 2019. And this series of convention is actually the continuation of the initial event of the Bandung Conference and beyond, which was held in 2015 to commemorate the 60 years of the Asia-Africa Bandung Conference. These events are part of the Institute of International Studies, Universitas Gadjah Mada's endeavor in developing insights into international relations studies from the Global South perspective. As mentioned by our head of department earlier, by taking the transcending the North-South divide, G20 and the multilateralism in turbulent global politics as the main theme, the 2022 annual convention actually aims at investigating the current stage of the G20 and the multilateralism in overcoming the North-South divide. This theme also reflects our effort to analyze and also evaluate the existing strategies to address the North-South divide and to foresee more effective strategies in the future. As Southern countries face challenges, many challenges from pressing global issues, including the COVID-19 pandemics, digitalizations, climate change, and energy transition, the quest for finding a better solution is becoming more urgent, especially in the existing divergence of the world politics, which is frequently labeled as the new Cold War phenomenon. In this context, failure to formulate better strategies would risk entrenching the North-South divide, which in turn obviously further impoverishes the South in the process. So in order to deliberate further on this concern, starting from today, the convention will be held until 15th of September and expecting participants from various backgrounds, including universities, NGOs, governmental institutions, think tanks, and etc. So to begin our discussion today, it is an honor for me to introduce Dr. Sarifah Munirah Alatas. Dr. Munirah Alatas is the assistant professor in the Strategic Studies and the International Relations program at the University Kebangsaan Malaysia. She earned her BA at the University of Oregon and her master's and also doctoral program from Columbia University. Her specialties are geopolitics, strategic thought, foreign policy, and as scholar and also academic activist, Dr. Alatas contributes significantly to her op-ed columns in Free Malaysia, Malaysia Kini, ASEAN, Defense Insight, and the Islamabad Policy Research Institute. Her opinions on current affairs, politics, and regional higher education developments are regularly sought after by the news portals such as the Malaysian Insight, Times Higher Education. The recurring themes of Dr. Alata's scholarly and popular writings are the West-centrism, intellectual imperialism, hegemony, academic dependency, and also post-colonialism. So on today's occasion, Dr. Sarifah Munirah Alatas will be delivering a keynote speech on Beyond a Critique of the Liberal International Order, Promoting Universal Ethics in International Affairs. By critically assessing the liberal international order, Dr. Munirah Alatas will discuss the significance of democratizing knowledge production in international relations and also the need to address the intellectual hegemony of the North systematically. So without further ado, please join me to warmly welcome Dr. Munirah Alatas. And please, Dr. Alatas, a 30-minute allocated time is yours. Thank you, Dr. Alatas, please.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you very much for also inviting me to deliver this lecture. I will try my best to keep it within 30 minutes. Please, yell at me if I go beyond the time. Let me try and share my screen right now. Yes, I need to share a section of my screen. I can't see that here. How do I do it? Can somebody... Just a second. Are you able to see my screen? Yes, okay. All right. Now, I've chosen this topic. I think some would be wondering what is the relevance to the G20 or the basics of international relations. But I think I need to speak a little bit about the bigger picture. So why did I choose this topic for today? Basically because lately we are in turbulent times and international affairs are a serious concern in both the global north and the south. It's not just the global south that are feeling the problems of the international system. Why do I say this? Because we are faced with a post-pandemic era. There is now war in the heart of Europe. There are disruptions to the economic activities and supply chains that are affecting us globally. As a result, there's also global inflation, widespread disease, as we have just experienced during the pandemic, death, human suffering, and overall skepticism about the future. And also not to mention the ongoing battle for global supremacy. So I felt that it is necessary to question the bigger picture of international affairs and not only, and basically to focus on the 21st century. The main question actually to ask is, are we in uncharted territory? And how and why did we get here to this situation? After what has been considered a long period of peace during the Cold War, and of course during what has been termed the unipolar moment. It has been a cause of concern in policy circles, the general public, and the scholarly community as well, because of a sense of economic, social, and geopolitical insecurity everywhere. So this is the reason I've chosen this topic. Now, the main points of my lecture, it will focus mainly on the role of ethics in world order making. Throughout my presentation, I use world order interchangeably with the terms liberal international order, or abbreviated to LIO, the American-led world order, or the liberal hegemonic order. So these are the terms I will use interchangeably. I will also unpack key ideas that go beyond the narrative of power relations and highlight the different perceptions about the LIO between the global north and the global south. These perceptions are mainly about the pessimism and skepticism about the future of international affairs. Is world order ending? Is it evolving? And if it is evolving, in whose favor is it evolving? So these are the main issues that we are grappling with. The universality of the principles of the LIO and how inclusive they are often debated. The majority assume that the LIO should be a universally accepted system. This is because ideas of the liberal political philosophy of the Enlightenment era have been promoted for centuries as universal humanistic values. For the most part, this is very true. However, this has been increasingly challenged because of the diversity of experiences and values in different societies. The prevailing perception of the LIO is now a mixed bag, depending on which side of the north-south divide we are. The majority on the side of the global north, they perceive the following, that even though America still feels threatened by China, its global leadership has been re-energized more since the conflict in Ukraine. Also, that the West's pushback against Russia is evidence that international order is still very much grounded in liberal and Euro-American values of state sovereignty. A third reason is that America must continue to push back against undemocratic China. And of course, that there is a heightened sense of renewed Western solidarity and multilateralism that is manifest in a united condemnation of Putin. The hope, of course, is that NATO continues to expand and support for sanctions against Russia increases. And of course, the hope that the West will get more support from the non-West. So generally, Western powers conceptualize world order as being grounded in timeless, universal political values of Western political philosophy. Enlightenment values promote greater individual participation in domestic politics, safe spaces for public critiques of bad governance, and separation of powers to uphold accountability and integrity of leadership. In other words, Western political thought, which is with its ethical values, is the foundation of today's world order. The assumption is that civilizations external to this intellectual tradition must catch up and adopt its ethics and morality. The global South, and of course this includes Southeast Asians, global South perceive the current world order differently. There is agreement that there are commonalities between Enlightenment values and many non-Western traditions, such as those embodied in ancient Chinese, Indian, and Muslim traditions. However, the global South has also observed the selective application of such values. For example, a key aspect of the LIO is globalization. Developing nations regularly push for more diversity and to be represented at key decision-making levels. World order under this liberal system is supposed to be characterized by multilateral and inclusive governance. However, in the case of, for example, the World Bank or the IMF, these organizations have yet to appoint experts from the global South to head their institutions. This is an example of the selective application of Enlightenment values of the LIO as perceived in the global South. Okay, it's about time now I try to define what world order is. It is a debated issue of how to define it, but for the purposes of my lecture today, I'll present two perceptions of world order, conceptualized along the global north-south divide. The widely accepted notion, the Euro-American definition, is that the LIO is about how power is distributed. In this perspective, world order is the ability to extend a nation's sphere of influence. A global south perspective of world order has gained traction as well. In this version, world order is an elite club of like-minded nations which prefer the use of military power, security alliances, and economic and financial blocs to maximize their gains in global governance, which they shape. From the global south perspective, many nations feel the global north pays less attention to ethics in international affairs. In the World Bank and the IMF examples that I cited earlier, smaller, weaker, and of course poorer nations remain voiceless in tabling global economic and financial policies due to their minimal roles in decision-making. Another example is when the US decided to invade Iraq in 2003. The decision made unilaterally, despite widespread protests from the developing world and protests also from a few in the north. Rather, and ironically, this act of American unilateralism was justified using the very language of the LIO. It was claimed that US and allied forces were liberating peoples from their despotic ruler and ridding the nation of authoritarian oppression. What is less discussed is the hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths since the 2003 invasion and the ensuing insurgency and civil war in the region. So at this juncture, I should reiterate that not everything about the present US dominated or US crafted LIO should be a source of anxiety for us. Many aspects of the liberal structures, such as the multilateral institutional rules-based system, multi-level avenues of cooperation, layers of connectivity and transparent spaces for open discussion, all of these have the potential to reduce conflict and maintain peace. The UN and its multi-tiered agencies are very good examples of this. The current LIO is also welcomed as championing a few universal norms, such as the right to healthy food, potable water, healthcare, gender equality, democracy, leadership accountability, free speech, and access to information. These are universal values which a majority of societies across the North-South divide accept as necessary for the advancement of humanity. Now, let me proceed to what the goals of world order are. I would like to list a few of these goals here in this slide, and I've listed 3. But in my next slide, there are a couple more which are more, you will see, are more subject to scrutiny. From a global South perspective, these goals may seem often rhetorical and removed from stark reality. Nevertheless, let's go through the first 3. The first is that nations, societies, and communities must be fair in their interaction with one another. This means cooperation and compromise must be the basis of interaction. The second goal is that societies should be healthier and happier. And this simply means less people dying from disease, more people feel economically secure, and more people are able to sustain their families. This contributes to a more organized, less chaotic world order. The third goal is that all states globally must subscribe to norms of behavior, monitored by inclusive rules which are just and global. Now, what about the 4 difficult goals that I mentioned earlier? These difficult goals, the current system appears to overlook. I list these based on developments over the last few years, but since the end of the Cold War in particular. There is evidence that big powers have contributed to humanitarian crises in the form of supporting civil wars and instigating regime change. This often happens when big powers prioritize their national interests, resulting in humanitarian crises, which can last decades. So these additional four ideals of world order are: first, to protect human rights and reduce human oppression and exploitation. The ultimate goal of world order, or rather world order making, is to reduce human indignity across all aspects of life. Second, to reduce poverty and increase food security, which is very important. I think it is the theme of the G20 this year. There is a need to reassess the excesses of capitalism and the free market system. The third goal is to create a more access to potable water. This is a serious growing problem in the developing world. And fourth, and quite importantly, to me, the most important goal to try and achieve is to aggressively address climate change and environmental degradation, where the global South will face critical challenges more than the North, sooner rather than later. So these four difficult goals represent the aspirations of a majority of post-colonial societies, meaning societies of the global South. They are largely silenced in the current discourses on world order. So what are these discourses? The debate is more about when US leadership of the LIO began to crumble, rather than if world order is in crisis. There is agreement that world order or international affairs is in crisis, and observers attribute this to America's turning inward and decoupling from multilateralism. There have been four broad strategic developments in the past decade, but more so within the last few years. And these are, I've mentioned briefly earlier, the rise of China, the COVID-19 pandemic, Russia-Ukraine war, and increasing view from the global South about the double standards exercised by the rich and powerful nations led by the US and smaller European powers. The discussions about the LIO revolve around, first, the Cold War foundations of its decline, and second, why this decline was accelerated in the post-Cold War era. So let me go to the first idea of the Cold War foundations of this decline. During the Cold War, there was already skepticism about the liberal aspects of world order from within the West, but predominantly felt also in the South, in the global South. Many in the West were becoming resentful of the costs entailed in maintaining military bases around the world, the high cost of defense spending, and the human cost of protracted regional wars. Many in the global South rejected the interpretation of the Cold War as a long period of peace. They rejected the logic that the balance of power through NATO and the Warsaw Pact was necessary to prevent World War III. There may not have been a World War III, but from a global South perspective, and from a Southeast Asian perspective included, there were too many regional conflicts at a tremendous human cost. The bipolar system of military alliances was hardly balanced, secure, or humane, given the ongoing human suffering brought about by the regional conflicts. And some of these conflicts I refer to are the Indo-Pakistan War and the Korean War, Vietnam, the Cambodian-Vietnam War as well, and the Congo crisis. So there are many of these. And of course, we also remember very vividly the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and how it has lingered on instability in the region. Now, the next one is after the Cold War, the post-Cold War. After the Cold War ended, there was more anxiety about world order, beginning with the Asian financial crisis of 97, Then we had 9/11, and then the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2008. More anxiety emerged about world order being under fire, under threat, or declining. First, the American public began to challenge liberalism domestically because they were losing jobs to countries like India, China, Indonesia, Vietnam, and other parts of the developing world. The LIO was being criticized by Americans themselves as a reaction to how the rest was developing and how global interconnectedness was actually a threat to American jobs. Then, of course, along came Donald Trump and the reality of his election slogan, which was "Make America Great Again." It was his strategy to get elected by capitalizing on American nationalist sentiments, which implied there was a need to reform the LIO. Now, this leads me to mentioning next the issue of ethics and national interest. China is still perceived as America's #1 threat, and Russia invaded Ukraine. The heart of Europe is still at war, and world order is in renewed crisis. Recent events prove that the LIO is governed by national interest, characterized by double standards. What do I mean by this? Ethics is hidden in the background and applied depending on how national interests of big powers can be further protected or not. What is considered universal in this context can often be manipulated to suit the occasion, depending on whether national interest is served. The application of double standards in strategic behavior is so prevalent in today's LIO that it is for this reason that there is growing dissatisfaction between the global North and South about the condition of international affairs. It is widely agreed that world affairs are controlled by powerful nations. However, there should be a united global South push for a more pluralistic and conceptually inclusive world order. This means revisiting the very foundation of liberal political philosophy that has influenced today's world order making. This brings me to my next discussion, which highlights a specifically global South perspective of what this revisit is. To reverse the dehumanizing effects of the current world order, leaders of the global South must work strategically and systematically to modernize their societies and the masses. In this way, small countries have the confidence to reject global North hypocrisy, knowing that their own leaders are united in a common struggle against global injustice. This is how developing nations can harness the power within to confront the hegemony of the existing LIO. They have legitimacy to proceed from a position of national resilience. Constructive dialogue between the North and the South is more likely when both parties engage in dialogue on equal terms. The global North may have material power, but the global South should ensure they have ideological, social, and moral and ethical power. Bringing both types of power to the negotiating table is likely to solve more problems than create them. Let me elaborate on what this moral power within is about. The power within that global South leaders unleash to their people is a strong message to the global North that these small, less powerful nations are morally and ethically equipped to craft a more inclusive global order. More importantly, developing nations should make it a point to see politicization of religion, education, social reform within their own countries. The majority of backward nations of the global South are regressing due to their own exploitative and authoritarian leadership. if there is moral reform, their citizens would feel less oppressed, and leaders would be justified in pushing for greater impact at the global level. There is great strength in moral legitimization, especially when it is possessed by the majority of Global South nations, which prefer a reformed and more inclusive global order or world order. Now, the theme of this conference, which is also bridging the gap between the North and the South, is what this slide now refers to. I understand this simply to mean as steps that states should take to ensure that they get along. Therefore, it is necessary to find common ground through dialogue and interaction. An important avenue for dialogue is through knowledge production. As such, it is essential to democratize how knowledge is generated in IR as an academic discipline. So I would like to focus on scholarship, academic departments, and the role of universities within the context of bridging the gap. There are two ways to do this. First, much more must be done to expand what is taught in IR departments around the world. In both the North and the South, the predominant IR theoretical canon is the Euro-American approach, which privileges themes of realism, domination, hegemony, material power, and national or self-interest as the discipline's foundation for analysis. This is understandable since IR as an academic discipline emerged from the ashes of war in Europe and further developed in the US. Basically, it was formed on Euro-American historical experiences. However, it is unacceptable to marginalize or neglect other traditions when we teach about world order. We must include more traditional or autonomous approaches to knowledge production in IR. We can do this by consulting thinkers and ideas that emerge from local settings or from indigenous societies shaped by that society's unique historical experiences. Indigenous societies or tradition is defined as peoples who have settled in the area for centuries, possessing distinct civilizational traditions, which include belief systems, economic and political systems, unique social structures, and general way of life. For example, let us look at the general practice in most Southeast Asian IR departments. While religion plays a very important role in many of our political and social lives, it is very rare to find a course in any IR department that focuses specifically on religion and IR. Also, the region's experience under colonial rule is a legitimate reason to include themes of religion and racism in IR, when we teach in IR or international affairs or geopolitics or even world order. In Malaysia, as an example, both religion and ethnicity feature very importantly in domestic politics, which impact ASEAN regionalism and the country's foreign policy. Ironically, courses on religion and ethnicity in foreign policy are rare in Malaysian universities. And if they do exist, they are most probably just elective rather than compulsory courses. Such courses are conceptualized as either country case studies or region specific, which means there is less probability of a systematic inclusion of religion and ethnicity as a theoretical component of the discipline. Similarly, it is rare to find a course on how social or people power impacts world order. This theme is highlighted in mainstream IR theory as a small part of the constructivist approach. This is a good start, of course, but it is inadequate when there are many themes that are left out, such as religion, belief systems, cultural norms, and ethnic struggles against racism and bigotry throughout the developing world. Also in the global South and prevalent in Southeast Asia, the dominant canon is perceived as intellectually superior as compared to indigenous knowledge. This is the phenomenon of academic dependency, which is obvious in the choice of reading resources used in syllabi, topics that are prioritized in classes as class modules, and themes chosen for research agendas and PhD thesis. In the Southeast Asian context, the persistence of academic dependency is due to the absence of a critical group of IR thinkers. Such a group, if present, would highlight the problem, and these scholars would try to introduce concrete changes. Rather, this intellectual movement in support of autonomous or indigenous theorizing, including teaching and publishing, has yet to emerge in the region. I see pockets of it emerging in different countries throughout ASEAN, but it has yet to be a movement within the IR canon. Now, academic dependency is a product of the intellectual hegemony of the West. It has given the big powers a head start, but it does not mean other nations cannot pluralize existing knowledges within the context of a reformed LIO. I think this would be my last point. Lastly, due to the global power shift that we have seen in world order, emerging powers such as India, China, Brazil, and smaller nations in Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Singapore, have more resources. We have more resources now, and we can train our own people. We are now equipped to dig deeper into our own history and publish in homegrown journals. Another development is that more European and American publishers are now based in Asia. We should also embark on more translation of our classic works, of our own classic works, but of course the works already written in English into English and into our indigenous languages. Don't translate it into English, it's already written in English. All this I have listed, I presume, and I hope would help bridge the gap between the global North and South. This slide shows, I will be asking the organizers to distribute my PowerPoint, and you will have an idea of the jackets, the books I have listed here. These are examples of what we can include in our teaching resources, because they include indigenous works or critical approaches, including tapping on some decolonial approaches to social sciences in general that we should incorporate into IR. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. I hope I took only 30 minutes, and if not, I apologize for going more than my allotted time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Munirah. I think it's a very interesting and thought-provoking argument regarding the liberal international order. And as I'm listening to your speech, I think it's a very important aspect that we need to discuss further. And it is, as it is mentioned on your speech, that the ILO is defined by free and open markets, international competitiveness, democratic governance structures, transparency, and cooperative security. As we also have witnessed over, as you mentioned earlier, that over the last 70 years or so, that this order has been dominated by the Western powers, mostly under the American leadership. However, you also argue that the selective implementation of this LIO is one of the main criticism of the current world order, especially from the perspective of the global South, or in other words, the double standards how international affairs are conducted have become one of the growing concerns of the society of the global South. So in this context, I think based on your speech, you argue that revisiting the liberal foundation philosophy is urgently needed. And in order to do so, the leaders of the global South must work strategically, systematically to modernize their society and people. And a critique towards the LAO must also focus on human dignity and include the ethical and moral dimensions in international affairs. So I think so many aspects that we need to discuss further. And we will now begin taking questions from the audience. I should inform that for those on Zoom, please use the raise hand feature. And if I call out your names, then please briefly introduce yourself and be mindful of being concise in addressing your question. But for those on YouTube, please write your questions on the YouTube chat box and we will read your questions for you. So I would like to invite from the audience, as I mentioned, please feel free to write your questions or probably use the feature of the raise hand if you're on Zoom. Anyone probably would like to start? Because I may not be able to check the conversation on YouTube. If the committee will be able to supply me with the questions from the YouTube, that will be great. Okay, we have Dr. Lukman Hakim. Aim, please. Time is yours.
Well, thank you, Ms. Chair. Thanks, Dr. Munira, for a wonderful presentations. My question is simple, in the sense that knowledge production is always entwined with the global dynamic, if you may call sociology of knowledge. And in the era of the post-multilateralism, if I may to call it now, with the growing of new economic epicenter of Eurasia and geopolitical aspect, which is more plural, what are the prospects of developing a non-Western IR in the future? Thank you.
Thank you.
Do I answer or wait for a group of questions?
We can wait, but if no questions yet, probably you can respond to Aim's question first, Dr. Munira.
Okay, sure. Thank you for the question. Knowledge production. I think I did mention towards the end that we need to keep asking the more relevant questions that affect our society. Right now, the way IR is taught and thought about and written and published about in our region concerns what the agendas are set by the big powers outside of our region. And part of the reason also, as you said, our whole university structure, the academic structure, is controlled by the liberal economic system, which ranks our universities, which promote our lecturers. So it's all entwined, I agree. But unless we recognize that there is a problem, rather than blindly follow through, we will not encourage our students to think outside the box, so that when they mature as lecturers, they will also decide to become that group of thinkers that have indigenous ideas. So we are now discussing or debating why IR is still very West-centric, but we are not able to offer an alternative. Maybe in sociology, in anthropology, we are succeeding. But as far as political science and definitely within the international relations discipline, we haven't stepped out to look inwards yet. So I'm not sure, Lukman, if I have actually answered your question. Please respond if you need me to say anything more.
Yeah, I think it is true.
Please.
Sorry to respond a little bit. It's true that knowledge productions of IR are highly defined by the interest from the external, and now we are witnessing that the global order are changing, and many, towards, if possible, multipolar world, and how, we at the Global South can capitalize this, development. For example, with whom we should partnering our research agendas, in this dynamic.
Are you asking a question? Sorry, was yours a question or a statement?
I think question.
The future. Yeah. I mean, is there any, strategic recommendations, by considering the changes in the current geopolitical situations, how we at the Global South, can build strategic alliance in knowledge productions, to capitalize these transformations?
Well,
following up questions.
Okay, I don't know if my answer is profound or not, but basically, we all within academia, as scholars, we write and we publish, but we are also aware of how there is so much hierarchy in the publishing process. We scramble to publish in Scopus and all that nonsense. Yeah, agreed. It is necessary to find journals and publishers that are of credible quality. On the other hand, our universities should tone down how they play the same game in terms of how we get promoted, or how the fact that we overlook lack of academic ethics. In order to get published, we do everything under the sun to get published, and are not ethical about it. We abuse our students that way. So in that sense, I would say, as I mentioned in my talk about how we need to find the power within, this is one aspect of it. If more of our countries can show some credibility in terms of dealing with the unethical practices within the universities itself, maybe that is a step towards reformatting the system. So that's my my suggestion and my opinion about the matter.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Munirah. And we have one more question here. It's from Ibu Siti Daulah. However, it is
trade. I think we've got to, for instance, the discourse about China and Sri Lanka, for instance. A lot of the discourse or discussion about why Sri Lanka is in such bad shape is because of the so-called debt trap. This is a debated issue, but the trend is to associate and link the collapse of Sri Lanka, the notion of debt trap, to China. Now and then everyone within the spectrum of IR and economics, or IPE, we discuss the debt trap. But there are other debates going on outside of this mainstream discussion. A very strong aspect of this discussion is that there is no debt trap. Why don't we unpack this? Malaysia's JOMO has already done so. There are many articles coming out that discuss from the Global South. Many African scholars are already discussing this. But it's not given much attention by Southeast Asian IR scholars. I think we should tap on these notions, counter the prevailing views about why countries fail, why countries become failed states. We can't just blame one superpower over another. Just because one superpower is rising, it's their fault that the rest are suffering. There are other reasons. So this dynamic is what I'm saying we should attempt from the Global South, attempt to publish and write and do research more on. I hope that has answered your query.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Munirah. We have another question. Please, you raise your hand Bapak Nuruddin, I suppose, if you may to turn your camera on, if it's possible, and please briefly introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you. My name is Nuruddin from Department of Politics and Government, Universitas Gadjah Mada. Thank you, Bobby. I have two questions to Professor Munirah. My first question is, can we say that the emergence of, for example, Laudato Si by Pope Francis and also the Islamic Declaration on Climate Change as an important discussion of IR and religion? You say that the discussion about religion and IR is rare in Southeast Asia. Can, for example, this theme Laudato Si and Islamic Declaration as an important contribution, an important actor in today's world order? That's my first question. And my second question is, you state that in the context of sociology and anthropology, the indigenous discourse has more developed than in IR and political science. I want to know, if I'm not mistaken, Hussein Al-Attas, he introduced the concept of sociology of evil and fool. I wonder, can this idea, the sociology of evil, can be contextualized to build the indigenous tradition of IR, for example, the world order of evil? I want to know your comment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Should I answer now? Yes. Okay. Thank you, Nuruddin. Okay, maybe I'll answer the last question first. The sociology of evil and the role of the fool in society. I think you got that from the book Intellectuals in Developing Societies. Well, yes, of course. Chapter 4, I think, that's the chapter on the fool. Yeah, there are many concepts and themes from this notion of the fool and sociology of evil that we can apply to world order. But insofar as critiquing this current system that is led by the West, it wouldn't help, because how it would help is my approach to the power within us. So we have to look for the fools in our society that have held us back in how we produce knowledge. That would be my answer. Including the sociology of evil, we have to turn inwards and look at how our leadership has developed. We cannot forever keep blaming colonialism on the behavior of our leadership today. To some extent, we have been held back by colonialism, but that is a part of our history that has also informed the current leadership that we have, but it doesn't mean that they cannot be reformed as well. So that would be my answer to your second question. The first part, I won't take too much time on this. It's just that the premise itself I don't agree with. I'm not sure about the Islamic approach or the declaration of in climate change itself. It's not my area of focus. But what I could tell you is that I'm very wary of the move to, the Islamization of knowledge or the Islamization of economics. Or I think we have to be very careful about this, because we persist then in the binary division between North and South, between East and West, between rich and poor. We create more divisions rather than bridges. So we have to be careful about that. But that would be my contribution to my answer to your first. I don't know if it helps, but that's my position. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Dr. Munira. We also have another question here from, I suppose this is from Mbak Nana. Mbak Nana, I would like to invite you to raise your question directly if you have no technical issues. Would you like to raise your question directly to Dr. Munira, please?
Okay, thank you, Mbak Poppy. I'm in the DigiLib Cafe now, so I hope the back sound is not really disturbing. Thank you for the speech, Dr. Munira Alatas. My questions to you, maybe just a bit of general questions on your position on sustainable development goals. So in your view, what would be the desirable world orders to make sure a just and sustainable futures? Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't get the question. Can you help me, Poppy?
Oh, okay. Sorry, Nana is in, I think, the public space, I suppose.
Yeah, I wasn't able to get it.
Yeah, her question is basically regarding the sustainable development goals. And she was wondering about your opinion regarding how or what will be the desirable world order to make sure for the just and sustainable future.
Oh, wow. That is such a broad question, and it requires a few books, actually, and a few years of discussion. But I would say that, well, we need to be involved in it a lot more, and we need to discuss it a lot more within the context of international relations as a discipline. But I'm sorry, I can't elaborate more. There's so much to do about that. It's just that we have got to, maybe I can suggest within the university context, rather than have separate, this is in Malaysia's example, because I'm familiar with it, rather than have separate institutions within the university that are devoted specifically to SDGs, I think it should be entwined and included in every possible social science course module, which it isn't yet. So in schools, primary schools, maybe that's one way to infiltrate the idea of and the seriousness of SDGs, how it's important for the globe. But other than that, I can't say much more. I'm sorry about that.
Thank you, Dr. Munira. Yeah, I would like to invite for other probably content or questions from the audience. Okay, we have another audience here, Dr. Munira. Please, Akmal, would you like to introduce briefly yourself and raise your question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Akmal Rabbani. I am from International Relations in Universitas Gadjah Mada. And I would like to ask, it was mentioned that the Global South can harness moral and social power to challenge the Global North's hypocrisy as well as dominance. But as I understand, they have material power, and considering how international relations, international politics has a nature of anarchy, as I consider it, then I would like to ask, is it even possible for Global South to harness social and moral power to challenge the Global North's material power in the international stage?
Okay, the premise itself is what I'm saying we should challenge. This is the realist or the Euro-American established thinking about international relations, which is the element of anarchy. Why don't we challenge that? Because the element of anarchy may not exist in other cultures, in other civilizations, whereas communication, connectivity, coexistence, cooperation is what moves and drives order. So the premise itself is what I'm saying may be a step towards overcoming the problems that we are facing. Because remember, we've had, since World War II, we've had so-called peace because we didn't have World War III. But the world was still organized according to potential threat and keeping anarchy at bay. I think we need to question the actual premise around that kind of thinking. So I hope that answers your query. Do you have a follow-up question? I'm sorry, I didn't get your name. Akmal, is it?
Akmal. Akmal, do you want to
follow up with that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we should challenge the notion of an anarchic international political stage. But my question is more of, is it even feasible or realistic in challenging it?
Yeah,
we should solely challenge it.
Yeah, this is not, of course, it's not going to happen overnight, but we, as I mentioned towards the end of my talk, I think it has to start with the way we teach about politics or geopolitics and international relations. It's the way we teach it. Maybe we should pay little attention to realism and neoliberalism, and maybe focus more on constructivism and other isms that may be generated by our societies, our experiences. Latin American scholars, African scholars, they are publishing a lot in this angle. And I think Southeast Asia, our region, has to follow suit. I mean, I may not agree with certain publications that are coming out of the Chinese scholars in China, but they came up with the Chinese school of international relations. Now, this is a commendable effort to challenge the current theoretical framework. Nevertheless, I don't think it's being done in our part of the world. And it's never too late to start, but it will start in terms of how we organize, how we teach it. And it's all up to you. Many of you listening in are actually junior scholars, so it's up to you to start taking the reins and moving ahead with this kind of approach.
Thank you, Dr. Munira. There is one clarification from Nuruddin here. If you may, should I read it for you?
Yes, please do. Yes.
Okay. Here, I think Nuruddin is trying to clarify that he thinks that the Islamic Declaration of the Global Climate Change is not the same as the Islamic Declaration of Human Rights, which emphasizing the distinction between the concept of right in the West and Islam. However, the Islamic Declaration of the Global Climate Change is a response to the Pope Francis' invitation through his Laudato Si to invite global religious communities to cooperate in overcoming environmental problems and criticism for the capitalism. So he argued that there is a dialogue between civilization, between North and South in that context. That's what he is trying to follow up based on his previous statement. Would you like to do that? Yeah.
Yes, now I understand. Yes, you're right. There is a form of intercivilizational dialogue going on there, which is very good. But as I said, these things must go in parallel with us in the Global South also taking care of our own backyard. I mean, we cannot participate in trying to change global affairs and have this intercivilizational dialogue going on, which is very good. At the same time, when we go back to our countries, we oppress our own people, and we claim that is done in the name of religion. So that's what I'm imploring, or I'm hoping that we a two-pronged approach, because the danger is we then become pontificators to the West, and then we become also hypocrisy. We are embroiled in hypocrisy as well.
That's very interesting statement, I suppose. If I may use my authority as chair to also ask you questions, Dr. Munira, I think it's very interesting, especially relates to your previous also comments regarding the blaming colonialism, for the current situations happening in the global south, as you mentioned previously, is also not wise in the current context. You mentioned earlier that the phenomenon of the coloniality at home, as you explained in responding to Nadine's questions earlier, also exists throughout much of the global south. So what do you think? How to overcome this? How to overcome what we see as the coloniality at home, while at the same time we are trying to, propose a different perspective in the world order. But we do have some homework, our own sort of like backyard. So what do you think, Dr. Munira?
Okay, that's a very serious question, and it's something that's close to my heart, and I continue to work on it. And even though, even when I retire, I want to continue doing this. Now, okay, let's look at our own region. We here in ASEAN, we have a problem child in Myanmar. We have, horrendous things going on in Myanmar. I understand that ASEAN needs to tread carefully, but at the same time, for instance, Malaysia has taken steps to do something different that ASEAN hasn't done before. I mean, as Malaysia has spoken to the government in exile and has publicized it. So there are baby steps that ASEAN can take to oppose the oppressive, the inhumane governments that exist within our regionalism, within our group. Of course, the coloniality that we all, in many of our countries, we experience bad leadership. I suppose we also have countries that declare themselves to have democratic political systems. Based on that, I suppose we just need to keep fighting and calling out our leaders for the bad behavior that they participate in. I mean, you know what's going on in Malaysia. We have finally put somebody in jail, and we never thought we would. Of course, it's an ongoing struggle, but there needs to be persistence on the part of those of us who can think. And this includes, we need to find and harness academics who have the commitment to change things. It's not going to happen in one generation, but there has to be persistence through it. They went through centuries of that, which is why they are now developed. But they sacrificed. So this is the kind of sacrifice we need to do. I don't know if that has helped you, Poppy, but it is.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Munira. For last, I think for this, I would like to invite Mas Riza. Would you like to also raise your question, Mas Riza, briefly?
Yeah, thank you very much, Poppy. Good to hear from you, Dr. Munira. I'm really pleased to have such a very inspiring, insightful, contemplative speech previously. And I have two questions. The first one would be a follow-up question from Poppy's question, and your take on that. Would you assume that the ASEAN value is sort of like an example of hypocrisy? That's probably too provocative, but would you accept that kind of assumption? And my second question is related to the problems that the IR as a subject have. Would you consider that the monodisciplinary nature, the tendency for monodisciplinary nature, would be the roots of the problems of IR in the global south? Meaning that probably much more multi or transdisciplinary approach would be the one that we need currently. Thank you.
Thank you, Riza. Those are very good questions and interesting. And actually, we should take it and run with it for the next 50 years, because this involves a lot of teaching and focus on how to reform our IR as a discipline. Now, first, let me get to the second question, which is transdiscipline or being monodiscipline. I was curious about how you said the problem with IR in the Global South, with it being monodiscipline, but that's not true. We have learned that from North. It has evolved as a monodiscipline for specific reasons. And this is associated with their history of having gone through 2 devastating wars. So there needed to be a method input of scholarly research as part of the bigger game on how to control powers. So the element of hegemony was in there. Keep it monodiscipline so that it's easy to control. Now, I don't want to get into that. It involves a lot more discussion on so many other angles. But what I would suggest is, and yes, we need to be more interdisciplinary when it comes to correcting the problems on how world order is with respect to our region. We have to be interdisciplinary. And that means drawing on concepts from that sociologists have been thinking about, anthropologists specifically, and even from literature, from the humanities, not just the other social sciences. And this is the problem in many of our countries, and specifically from my experience, the rigidity about what books we can use in our syllabus or what articles we can list in our syllabus. Now it's no longer articles, it's books. There's too much rigidity of how we are supposed and permitted to teach our discipline. And this, I find, is happening too much in our part of the world. So we must look into that. Now, your first question, a leftover of how the West is thumbing us down because we refuse to take sides in the current big power competition that's going on in our region. I don't think ASEAN is a failure or a big hypocrisy just because we have this so-called ASEAN way and we have so many problems. The point is, look at it this way. Yes, ASEAN is in a trouble of this entire globe. Yet, look at it historically. Which region is the most peaceful? And why? And ASEAN has grown rather than disintegrated. In fact, I wouldn't be so upset if there is talk about, because of the Myanmar problem, but there are legitimate reasons should ASEAN take steps about Myanmar. But the point is, I would refrain from saying ASEAN is a failure or is hypocritical in its diplomatic language. The bottom line is, all of that has helped ASEAN since 1967 to keep the region still open and free of a major war. We have serious problems. We have a belligerent China, and we have other powers in contestation. But we still have that centrality. We still have that agency. So I hope that I like the question, but I also think it's a very valid one. And I want to not say that it is we are hypocritical in our approach, because we have succeeded, I would say. We just need to step up our game when it comes to Myanmar, because that situation is horrendous, and it's the leadership there are thugs, and we cannot have thugs in charge in our region.
Thank you very much, Dr. Munira.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Munira. We'll be waiting for one more question if it's available from the audience before we close the session. No questions on YouTube. I don't see any supply questions from the committee from the YouTube, I suppose. Oh, well, if we have no more questions, then Dr. Munira, I think this is really my pleasure to chair the session. And it is really insightful to listen to your speech. And thank you so much for also everyone for posing very exciting questions and also contributing to our fruitful discussions. And I believe that this kind of event is one of the part of the endeavor to, to create and probably to generate the Global South sort of like perspective, even though it's still quite far from now. But I think we have to give us some credits to do that effort. And thank you, Dr. Munira, once again. And my apologies if for any mistakes and inconvenience while chairing this session. So please join me to give a big round of applause for Dr. Munira. Thank you again, and it's been a pleasure for me. And now I would like to hand over the session to the master ceremony. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Munira, for sharing your insight and also knowledge on Global South and how to bridge the North-South divide. Thank you also for Dr. Poppy for chairing. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now entering the panel discussion session, which will be led by Ms. Yulida Nuraini Santoso. Ms. Yulida, are you here?
Yes. Hello, Karis.
All right. So, everyone, Ms. Yulida is lecturer at the Department of International Relations in Universitas Gadjah Mada. She's formerly also a Chevening awardee at University College London and currently serves as the Managing Director of ASEAN Studies Center, Universitas Gadjah Mada. Her interests includes transnationalism, regionalism, and also ASEAN in its political security context. Ms. Yulida, you may have the floor.
Thank you very much, Karis. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the annual convention of the Global South 2022. This year we engaged the topic of transcending the North-South divide, G20 and multilateralism in turbulent global politics. My name is Yulida Nuraini Santoso. I have the honor of chairing today's discussion. Now today's discussion is very straightforward. We will start with a presentation from each of our panelists, which will then be followed by a question and answer session before we conclude the conference for today. However, tomorrow we will continue with a series of panel discussions, so please stay tuned and rejoin us there. So today's discussion will look at the thoughts of three panelists on the role of emerging economies of the South and the role that they play in shaping key global agendas. Our first panelist is Dr. Riza Nur Arfani from Universitas Gadjah Mada. Our second panelist is Dr. Alexander Davis from the University of Western Australia. And last but not least is Dr. Sarah Davies from Griffith University. However, Dr. Sarah has become unavailable to join us today, hence her recorded presentation provided be played later on in our discussion. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Riza Nur Arfani. Dr. Riza is a lecturer at the Department of International Relations, Universitas Gadjah Mada, and currently serving as the director of the Center for World Trade Studies. His areas of expertise include international trade, environment and governance, as well as digital economy and data governance. Arfani has also been working with the World Trade Organization under its Academic Chairs Program and is presently a chairholder since 2010. He is also a National Knowledge Partner for G20 for the 2022 Digital Economy Working Group. Arfani's notable works include the investment chapter of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and Indonesia, a book chapter in Emerging Global Trade Governance, Mega Free Trade Agreements and Implications for ASEAN, a book chapter co-written with Poppy Eswinanti titled How Far Can Indonesia Go? Utilizing TSIA, or the Trade Sustainability Impact Assessment on the would-be Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, Impact for Indonesia, and many more. So without further ado, Dr. Riza, the time is yours.
Thank you very much, Dida, also for the warm introduction. And a very good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for inviting me, for the committee, for the colleagues at the Institute of International Studies at the Department of International Relations, or OGM. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of our works, being, as Dida mentioned, National Knowledge Partner for the Ministry of Communications and Informatics of the Republic of Indonesia. So I will be on behalf of other colleagues, including Mas Aim, Mbak Poppy, others who also involved in the works in the past year. Yeah, sort of like accompanying the works of the ministry in the current presidency of Indonesia in the G20 Digital Economy Working Group. So let me share my screen. So here's the title of my presentation, and as mentioned earlier, I will be focusing more on policy-oriented, technical, practical aspects of the G20, and in regards to our topic today, in how to transcend the North-South divide, the G20 and multilateralism in turbulent global politics. And as you see in the title, I put there the geo-economizing the North-South nexus, indicating that what I would like to present is sort of like a geo-economic perspective in comprehending debates on digital economy in the G20, especially in the G20 Digital Economy Working Group. I believe I will be having 30 minutes, right, for my presentation, Dida?
Yes, Pak Riza, you're correct.
Okay. So I have around, or exactly 12 slides, including the cover slide. And I will divide the presentations into 3 parts. The first one would be the background of my presentations, the context of our digital economy issues in the G20 framework. The second part will be my major or key proposed argument, where I try to put the G20 forum as part of economic statecrafting of the digital economy. And then lastly, in the last part, in the third part, I will try to sort of like explore diverging positions and interests of various stakeholders in the digital economy by, for example, redefining digital economy strategic objectives and how it relates to a conceptual framework of economic diplomacy, and how then also it relates to digital transformation strategy, and how we then take the benefit of the Digital Economy Working Group under the G20 to move forward and put some agenda that will be capitulated in a framework of a multi-stakeholders dialogue. So that's basically the idea of my presentations. So let me first note that in terms of its historical trajectories, the G20 would serve a bridge, I think, between the diverging academic or even policy positions to development. If you look at the emergence of this G20 group, then you can, practically speaking, look at how the forum has been made as a premier forum for international cooperation, established by, first of all, the G7, when they tried to broaden the dialogue on key economic and financial policy issues among systematically significant economies and promote cooperation to achieve stable and sustainable world economic growth that benefits for all. So that's the idea that coming from the G7 group. But also, if you notice very carefully, they also include the ideas of development that have been developed also under the APEC forum, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. I will come back to that later on. But also, they also include the idea of the UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, development agenda that also put forward the key roles of the so-called G33, the groups of 33 countries that are coming from the global south, most of them. So basically, the idea of the G20 is already serving the bridge, or I may call it the nexus, that transcend the global south and the global north paradigms, or even positions towards certain issues in development. And I will try to look more deeply on the digital economy notions. And also, if you look at the historical trajectories of digital economy itself under the G20, then basically we haven't seen too long, in a much longer period, how this idea of digital economy inserted in the G20 forum. Only last year that the leaders of the G20 agree to establish the so-called Digital Economy Working Group, DEWG, after the periods of operations of Digital Economic Task Force since 2016, since the presidency of China. But then, beginning last year, we have this platform of DEWG, and we as the holder of the presidency this year has served as the key chair now that tried to bridge diverging ideas, diverging positions, interests of many countries in the G20. So I would say that the nexus is there. The nexus is now being the platform of our talk in digital economy. So would they also share orientations when they talk about digital economy? I would say yes. They share common understanding. They even share that digital economy is a major catalyst in working with this nexus of digital economy. If you look at the G7 concerns on the governance structure of the overall international economic and finance system, then, as I mentioned earlier, they need a broadened scope of international economic and financial cooperation that also include other key actors, notably the emerging economies, and then that part of the intention that would also comprehend the way that the G20 also include the UNCTAD-driven agenda of the G33. Inclusions of the G33 countries represent a wide range of emerging and smaller industrial economies to strengthen the international financial architecture. If you look at the history, then they have managed to organize follow-up G22 seminars that happened between the 1997 to 1998 under the APEC forum legacy. During those time, these two groups have been in a very close work collaboration to sort of like design the G20 architecture, the G20 platforms. And when it comes to digital economy, then also the shared orientation would be also belongs to the need for digital transformation, to the need that digital economy and its transformation would contribute to more inclusive outcomes, to also helping in efforts in developing countries for more international support, so that also we could also come up with integrations of digital dimensions into their aid policies and strategies, also to their transformation, industrial transformation strategy. So in this sense, we have this a very clear shared orientations of North and South in the G20 digital economy working group, and DE serve as a major catalyst. So then we could then serve the so-called digital economy working group as the platform of our understanding, of our comprehensions towards bridging or making a nexus between the global South and the global North. With these backgrounds, with these backgrounds that we understood the G20 as a norm-setting forum, with also the understanding that the last year mandate for the G20 is there to address how to leverage digital technologies through the sharing of information and views, and seeking an understanding on policy to enable digital economy for resilient, sustainable, and inclusive growth and development with a safe, secure, and connected digital environment, while also mitigating the challenges and risks of digitalization. So that kind of mandate have been there since last year, and with very specific working directions that have been adopted by this working group, so that we could then imagine this this kind of a norm-setting forum, especially under the digital economy working group, would be our opportunity to serve the forum as either a cooperative norms forum, hegemonic norms forum, or a decentralized norms forum. Judging from our observation during the past year, these norms cascading endeavor has not yet resolved under the DEWG forum. And we still have yet to struggle on that, whether we could come up with certain agreement on certain values. For example, in understanding on the data governance, how to regulate privacy, and so on. So that kind of things that we need to especially look forward when we talk about this platform of the EWG under the G20 forum. Now I'll come to the next part of my presentation, where I put my proposal here. I would say that when we look at digital economy as an issue under the G20 forum, then we should also take into account that this also will be part of our understanding, our comprehensions to geopolitics, to how then this geoeconomic issue, such as the one that offered by digital economy topics, would be also pretty much heavily influenced by the geopolitics. And I would say that the ideas of geoeconomics, especially offered by this Marianne Schneider-Petzinger idea of having to use the economic tools to project power, especially in the backdrop of that is that the Chinese rising, the Chinese getting attention to these economic things, so that we need to then think about what Hillary Clinton call it as economic statecrafting. So I would say that we need to sort of like also come up with this idea of statecrafting the economy, including the one that also we talk on digital economy issues. So that's the key ideas when we talk about geo-economizing the digital economy. And then finally, we need to also have this idea in mind that what we have when we talk about digital economy is somewhat that is state-crafted, meaning that geopolitics, political realism would be the backdrop of any ideas offered in digital economy. So meaning that we need to deal at least in two fronts. The first one would be economy at home, where I think the digital transformation strategy would be belongs to. And then secondly, on its external front, on economic diplomacy. And I would come up with the idea of having 3D approach, digitizing diplomacy. This kind of 3D approach that I would like to offer in this very specific moment. So that what we need to understand further is how we move forward towards creating or defining strategic of digital economy under certain economic diplomatic model, meaning that we need to focus on economic diplomacy as it relates to digital economy in economic diplomacy. And I would say that this is the approach of 3D would be in action, and linking it to the economy at home, how DTS policy scheme and roadmaps could be the key objectives of having economic diplomacy that is relevant to digital economy. So now I'll come to my last part of my presentation. How should we define strategic objectives of digital economy when we have these adoptions of economic diplomacy under the norm-setting forums such as the G20 Digital Economy Working Group? I would say that first of all, first thing first, we need to shift our paradigm when we look at the economic diplomacy practices. We need to focus on economic matters in order to accommodate this key systemic level process, signifying the roles of the G20 DEWG. And in this sense, I think our department has come up with the idea of having a very specific study program, specific programs on digital economy and in relations to diplomacy, in relations to national competitiveness. And I think in this regard, we have signified the importance of connecting the G20 DEWG norm setting forum to the one that we need to upgrade our competitiveness at home, in our industrial transformation strategy. But secondly, also it means that we need also to look very carefully the changes to organizations of diplomacy within governments and the development of new formats of diplomatic practices alongside with new diplomatic actors. I would suggest the idea of transnationalizing the G20, the EWG forum, to include track 2, track 3, so forth, diplomatic actors. And in this regard, I will come up at my last point to the idea of multi-stakeholders dialogue forum that also have been adopted in the past DEWG meetings. So that kind of things that we need shifting paradigm to conceptualize and to practice the contemporary economic diplomacy, especially to take the benefits of digital economy. But then also we need to also shift from conventional, traditional, realist, no realist perspective to, or in a mixture of, with the contemporary understanding of economic diplomacy, which regard diplomacy that cannot be compartmentalized into separate economic and political activity. And that, in practical terms, most countries now would find such a separation simply unworkable. So here we have this idea of having more collaborations, more coordinations among relevant ministries. If we take Indonesia as an example, then we have to look forward for having more collaboration between the Ministry of Communication and Informatics, for example, to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to Ministry of Industry, even to other more technical ministries, to sort of like develop a key strand in diplomatic strategy, the one that offered by this idea by Michael Okano H. back then in 2011, when he sort of like proposed the idea that when we look at the economic diplomacy, what we need to look more carefully is the one that belongs to the lower left quadrant, the so-called trade diplomacy or commercial diplomacy. That's the one that we need to look for much more carefully, rather than we look at the opposite quadrants, the upper right side of this diagram. Meaning that we need put politics as a tool, but the primary goal is still economy. Meaning that when we talk about digital economy, the primary goal would be our digital transformation strategy. And then we try to look whether the G20, the EWG would serve as a appropriate forum to do so, or whether we need to also look for other international platforms, such as the one that already existed under the WTO e-commerce joint statement initiative that also happening since 2018. But in short, we need to move downward when we look at this diagram and try to develop a specific strands of economic diplomacy that belongs to the idea of trade diplomacy or commercial diplomacy. And then finally, here is what I'm thinking about having a digital transformation strategy when we look at under the the platform of DEWG of the G20. TTS as part of the G20 North-South Nexus. These are the key contexts. We have shifting economic paradigms. We have this digital metamorphosis where digital technologies are driving transformative change. Economies are experiencing unfolding digital metamorphosis. Latest advances, for example, in AI and related innovations are expanding the frontiers of digital revolution. Digital transformation is accelerating as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic. And finally, the future is arriving faster than expected. That's the shifting paradigms that we currently having. But alongside with that, we have also major challenges of the new digital ecosystem, rising inequality and related disparities, and even social anxiety that stoke social discontent. That also major problems that we have. They are a major driver of the increased popular disaffection and political polarization, and the rise of nationalist populism that are also so evident today. The trends reveal a striking contrast between the promise of brilliant new technologies and the actual economic and social outcomes. The national economic pie has been growing more slowly and more unequally. The benefits of technological transformation have been also shared highly unevenly. So those are the problems that we are currently facing. Also, we have this context of digital disruption, the evolutions of computer internet technology, the evolutions of the inflections of the roles of the smartphones and cyber physical technologies such as sensors, and the breakthrough that we have with regards to digital data and how we look at the data through the works of algorithms, through artificial intelligence. Meaning that this kind of context would then need to be really understood when we talk about having digital transformation and how digitalization, turning data and networks into digital content and services would also relate to the efforts of the so-called datafication, a growing tendency to create digital representations of even more areas of the real world in order to derive value from information obtained. And this is sort of like symbolic analytical notions of data, but also networks, more sophisticated level of digital networking that making society and economy now, practically speaking, is network in a very, what do you call it, in a very direct term. So everyone now is networked through your smartphone. We now belongs to such evolutions of the technology, but also in terms of digitization, digitization. The one that have a more technical dimensions of digitalization, meaning turning analog data into digital machine readable data. We have this also as a constant phenomenon in the past 10 or 15 years or so. Constant digitization saturates networks with more and more data, meaning that we are in the era of data glut. If we refer to the past notions of oil glut here. Now data is the new oil. Data is the new oil, but we now have also the phenomenon of data glut. When we talk about this data glut, we need also to have this in mind, that digitization strategy or even the macro level digitalization strategy need to be conducted. So finally, in my last slide, I would say that when we talk about those notions of digital economy, when we relate them to the G20 phenomenon, the platforms of digital economy working group, then we have this picture. We have the picture that really affected by, first of all, our understanding of a geo-economic of digital economy. How we understand digital economy in terms of geo-economic relevance, its geo-economic relevance. But also we have this significance of norm setting, especially under the G20. I would say that G20 would be much more significant than the one that, for example, initiated by the WTO under the joint statement initiative of e-commerce, because of the scope here. The scope of the DEWG is much larger than the one that have been negotiated under a plurilateral negotiation on GSI, on e-commerce. So I would say that the G20 DEWG forum is a very suitable platform when we talk about its norm setting design. But then also we need to put those two contexts to the one that is very relevant to the Global South countries' interests, or in certain areas would be positions. And these three would be the one that have been put forward by our presidency in the G20 and have been put forward by the chairs of our DEWG during the past year: digital literacy, digital connectivity, and also the one that is much more significant, that regulate data when it crossed the borders. Yeah? CBDF, DFFT, cross-border data flows, and also data free flow with trust. The third areas of concern would be the one that is probably much more significant to our interests and positions when we talk about economy at home. How to relate these areas to the overall industrial transformation strategy on the Global South. How digital data privacy and security would also relate to the needs to counter cybersecurity issues, to counter issues of strategic sectors, public sectors, how also to concern with who should be put as an what do you call it, a supervisory body when we look at how the data is regulated. The thing that we are still debating on our PDP, our RUU PDP, perlindungan data pribadi, privacy data privacy protection rights that we have now having currently. On digital infrastructure, also we need to have more attention to that. And finally, also on digital literacy in relations to works, how precarious works that have been offered by digital economy, and how digital transformation would serve to also address such precarity of the works, of digital works, and how we could pull the talents and so forth. In short, what we need to do is something that is very related to the one that we have been talking in the platform of DEWG. When we talk about having a more inclusive dialogue, what we call as a multi-stakeholders dialogue forum that have been started just a month ago, under the DEWG platform. And in terms of economic diplomacy, we need to also really put forward the need for comprehending digitalization's efforts in terms of datafications and in terms of digital networking, but also in terms of digitization as a saturated digital networks. I would say that the forum, the dialogue forum, the multi-stakeholders dialogue forum would serve also as a platform to meet or to bridge diverging interests, positions when it comes to digitalization, when it comes to digitization, and finally when it comes to our approach to digital transformation. So with that, I'll close my, I'll end my presentation. Thank you, Dida.
Thank you very much, Pak Riza. Just in time. I think you highlight a very interesting point on economic diplomacy and how this can be and should be utilized to change the shape, the landscape of politics to the benefit of the Global South, if I may phrase it that way. Hopefully we can discuss this further later on in the session. I would now like to invite and introduce Dr. Davis. Mr. Alexander Davis is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Western Australia. He is currently serving as the head of the Australian Himalaya Research Network and is a foundation member of the network New International Histories of South Asia. Davis's research looks at the historical, critical, and post-colonial perspectives of international relations, with a primary research interest on the geopolitics and ecology in the Himalaya, and a secondary research interest in the Indian diaspora in India-Australia relations and the possibility of decolonizing Australia's international relations. Davis has recently authored a book titled The Geopolitics of Melting Mountains, an International Political Ecology of the Himalaya, scheduled to be published in Palgrave 2022. Davis also has an extensive list of notable works published in reputable journals, which includes Bordering the Post-Colonial State, The Relevance of Sikkim in India's Support for Indonesia's Occupation of East Timor, published in Commonwealth and Comparative Politics, together with Rebecca Stratting in 2022. International Relations and the Himalaya, Connecting Ecologies, Cultures and Geopolitics, published in the Australian Journal of International Affairs, together with Ruth Gamble, Gerald Roche, and Lauren Gon in 2021, and many more. And with that, Dr. Davis, the time and screen is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's lovely. It's lovely to be here with you all this afternoon. So I'm speaking to you this afternoon from the unceded Noongar land in Western Australia, and I just want to quickly pay my respects to Noongar elders past, present and emerging. Good afternoon from a very cold, wet and windy day here in Perth. I really wish that I could be with you in person today, and thank you very much for having me. So Professor Munira's keynote raised some really interesting and important issues to my mind about the possibility of decolonising international relations and the transformation of its knowledge production. And I hope that you know that in this endeavour that you do have some allies in the West. So I'm primarily a researcher focused on Indian foreign policy, and I've also written a book about the colonial origins of the discipline of international relations. And from that study, I'd argue that Indian foreign policy, that the origins of the discipline of the study of international relations are not so much Western as they are colonial. a lot of international relations foundational ideas came from the colonial frontier. They were worked out by colonial thinkers who were based in places like South Africa and India, but also from Australia and Canada. And those ideas were circulated around the empire through the study of international relations, sent back to the imperial metropole, and they were used to justify their domination of world order. Now, India and Indonesia's post-colonial foreign policies played a really crucial role in the decolonization of world order. And I think that legacy continues partly with our proceedings today. And that's one of the reasons that I was so keen to talk to you this afternoon. So my historical research in Indian foreign policy has mostly looked at the ways in which India has tended to resist racial and colonial hierarchies after independence and into the present day. And I think it still does this in some important contexts. We can see this in its activism at the WTO, the G20, its efforts to challenge and invert the hierarchies at play in the liberal international order. But more recently, India's improving relationship with the US and Australia has led people here and in America to assume that India has sort of shed its post-colonial identity and is starting to behave the way that any quote-unquote normal democracy would do, and will sort of join a struggle with them against China and against authoritarian states. This, to my mind, is really not the case at all. It's based on Western colonial imaginings and assumptions about India and Indian foreign policy. India's foreign policy is still fundamentally shaped by its post-colonial identity, and we can see that partly in its approach to dealing with climate change as well. But studying international affairs from a post-colonial perspective, looking at the historical colonial legacies of Indian foreign policy also has drawn my attention to the ways in which India maintained colonial hierarchies at home, and particularly colonial practices of bordering in some of its frontiers. That original colonial creation of borderlands, the drawing of lines on the map by colonial powers, has been maintained today by the international system, by the connection between sovereignty, culture, territory, and nationalism. And this is also connected to this rise of majoritarian nationalism in India and China. And that's what's drawn my attention to these borders, to the Himalayan region, and to its environmental politics. And when we look at the Himalaya, when we look at Himalayan Asia, the state-based focus of international relations becomes really insufficient. And I think this has really important meanings for the idea of climate justice. And that's what I'm going to take you through this evening. So China and India agree on a huge amount in the sort of Conference of Parties process, the UNFCCC process, and the global push to move into a green energy, to transition to green energy. The Global South and developing states in these negotiations draw on these climate justice arguments through the principle of common but differentiated responsibility for climate change, and they are completely right to do so, by the way. This is accepted by all serious negotiators as something that needs to take place, that the West has industrialized, that's given it its economic dominance, and it's sort of extracted a huge amount of value from the Global South. And so it's necessary that places like China and India, but also Indonesia, decarbonise more slowly so they have a chance to develop before reaching net zero targets. So China aims to peak in 2025, peak emissions in 2025, and then drop off slowly, hitting net zero by 2060. India plans to peak a lot later in 2045 and has set a net zero target for 2070. But it's important to note then that these targets are still ultimately insufficient and incompatible with the UNFCCC goal of a 1.5 degree warmer world. Now, the reason that, so I say that, but it's more important to think through just how are these plans to get to net zero taking place, and that raises questions of climate justice, but for who? A key part of the way that both of these major states are planning to reach net zero is through hydropower dams on Himalayan rivers. And that's what brings in these questions of climate justice. That a lot of these rivers that are central to the sort of the Himalaya is Asia's water tower, and when looking to create a green energy transition and by decarbonising, this is being shaped by their geopolitical rivalry. These rivers flow through contested borders. There's a geopolitics to this, which is really important and really central. But these border disputes raise really interesting questions of climate justice, colonisation by post-colonial states, and questions of geopolitics that I think are really important to think through. So this takes us back to a bit of a keynote speech, but I want to start by, to understand this talk, you need to understand how the Himalaya looks in international relations. And it's really dominated by this states and security realist geopolitics paradigm for thinking about India, China, and Pakistan relations, but Nepal and Bhutan as well. The focus in the region is on strategic elites, on foreign policy elites operating out of places like Delhi, Beijing, and Islamabad. And Nepal and Bhutan are only talked about as buffer states, small states that have to find a position within the rivalry between India and China. And then there's all this scholarship on basically on military strategy. There's really only one question that's asked within this dominant body of scholarship. Conflict or cooperation? Under what context will they cooperate, and under what context will they fight? But I think this is sort of insufficient. This is indispensable to understand the region, the geopolitical questions of conflict and cooperation, but ultimately it's insufficient to understand the region for a variety of issues, and it obscures as much as it tells us. So it misses the role that the environment plays in the conflict itself, in creating the border conflicts. It erases the cultural diversity of the mountains. We're talking about a place, about large numbers of peoples, cultures, linguistic groups that don't sit comfortably within the cultural mainstream of India or China. It looks at the history of the construction of borders and foreign policy elites. There's some outstanding historical research into the creation of these borders, but it doesn't go much deeper than that. It doesn't question the idea of bordering Himalayan ice caps in the first place. Now, particularly important, so the Himalaya is sort of a periphery. It's a geopolitical periphery. It's a geopolitical periphery, but in terms of the environment in the world, in terms of global climate change, it's actually the center. It's actually the sort of the core area that we need to be thinking about. So the Himalaya ice caps, for example, they create all of these rivers that have enabled the enormous population density that we see in South, East, and Southeast Asia. But it also enables the monsoon. So the monsoon is caused by hot, dense winds coming north up off the Indian Ocean, hitting the high peaks of the Himalaya. That causes it to cool down, and that leads it to fall back down onto the Earth's surface as rain, and that maintains these enormous rivers that have enabled the population density in South Asia and East Asia and Southeast Asia as well. So what that means for us is that the India, China, Pakistan border conflicts in the Himalaya are far more complicated than usually acknowledged in international relations, and they require really different solutions than simply fixing the correct borders and coming to state-based agreements. And I think that this holds broadly for environmental politics around the world and for the green energy transition more generally. Instead of just looking at sort of states as geopolitical actors, we need to look at the ways in which cultures and ecologies and geopolitics are entangled with one another. And the Himalaya is an ideal place to think that through. So I like to show this slide whenever I'm talking about it because I think it gives you a really strong sense of the region that we're talking about, that it's an incredibly distinctive, transboundary, international region that has been dissected by state actors who are sort of squabbling over its resources instead of finding ways of constructing transboundary management over its resources in the region. Now, this is why it's so significant, and I'll focus my talk primarily on on this one river, but it's part of a much broader international river system that so many of Asia's large rivers, most of Asia's large rivers, emerge from the Tibetan Plateau and the high peaks of the Himalaya. So some of these are obviously really important to ASEAN states, to Southeast Asia, but this is also the water tower for China and for India and for Pakistan. So these are the types of rivers that are being dammed en masse for the purposes of creating green energy, and many of them cross international borders as well. And I'll focus on the Yalu Tsampo Brahmaputra River when covering that element of the story. So just a little bit of background about this presentation. So the chair noted that this is part that I've been working on a book called The Geopolitics of Melting Mountains. That is where this research comes from. And the key thing there is that a systemic critique about the way that state actors that have been sort of mapped over this incredibly diverse and intense topography are starting to transform and reshape that topography, and that this is causing a huge number of environmental issues that have serious implications for the idea of a just transition to green energy. So this is really about, it's not about which state is the worst or most nefarious actor. It's about what has happened with the mapping of a lowlands political system onto foothills and high peaks of an environmental region, and how that has started to transform the region. So I want to re-theorize how the international system in the Himalaya works, with Himalayan ecologies and local communities at the center, and with an awareness that the environment, the earth, is a geopolitical actor, and it transforms geopolitics, and human activity is similarly transforming. It's transforming the earth, which is transforming the geopolitics that we face. And I think that is a useful way of thinking about climate change politically, the relationship between humans and the earth, and how that reshapes geopolitics. The case studies that I'm particularly focused on in the book are the Western Himalaya, Sikkim, Nepal, Bhutan borderlands, and then the Brahmaputra River Basin. And I'll focus on the Brahmaputra this afternoon. So international relations tends to be state-centric, focused on conflict and cooperation, the focus on states disregards local peoples, the history of state-making. People in the region were sort of disengaged from that process of international state-making. And this obsession with state actors really distorts the way that we view geopolitics in the Himalaya. But in order to address this, I've turned to political ecology and so I see international relations as an interdisciplinary practice rather than a single solid discipline. International relations is far richer and far more engaging a form of study when you sort of break it open and try to flood it with knowledge from other disciplinary areas. So political ecology is the study of the relationship between politics and ecology, seeking to politicize ecological destruction. And it emerges from this partly Marxist tradition and is generally focused on the global south. What political ecology tells us to do is to no longer see human activity and politics as being disconnected from the planetary backdrop in which it takes place. We need to think about, but it hasn't yet thought about the role of state-based tensions and cultural and ecological crises in this particular region, where I think it's particularly intense. But I would also suggest that that connection between humans and politics and the planet is that holds for the rest of the world. So what I've sort of come up with in order to fuse these two together is a sort of hybrid called international political ecology. And if we think through this region with an understanding of how this system works in the Himalaya, with an emphasis on the region's more than human ecology, then we have a much deeper understanding of its politics. So I'm seeking to blend critical IR approaches particularly post-colonial international relations with political ecology scholarship. But political ecology scholarship hasn't yet really zoomed in on the geopolitical side of things, the role of states contesting borders and what that does to an ecological zone or to the planet more broadly. So in order to do this, I argue we need to look at the interconnections between different scales. So we have the level here of the earth, of rocks, mountains, plants, water, ice caps, animals. We have a level there of people, of locals, nomads, but also in the Himalaya we have engineers, soldiers, tourists and labourers. There's far more people sort of taking to the Himalayan ice caps than there ever have been before. And we have the international level, the level that international relations is really comfortable with and good at analysing. We have prime ministers, presidents, diplomats, foreign policy elites, people making important decisions about the region and about the world, but that is impacting what is happening on that more local scale and also that level of earth, rocks, mountains, plants. Then we need to look at the global scale, the sort of transnational capitalist system that we live in, and the Earth's climatic systems. What happens at the planetary level is affecting and is going to continue to affect local ecosystems. That is very much the case in Indonesia. It's the case in Perth. It's the case in the Himalaya. It's the place. It's true everywhere. And what we need to think through is how do these different scales interact with one another to produce different environmental and political outcomes. So what I'll do with the rest of my time is take you through how that is affecting this one particular river system. So the Brahmaputra River, I think, is the best place to think this through if we're talking about transboundary rivers and ecosystems. It's a really remarkable, unusual river. It's the highest river in the world in terms of its altitude. It emerges at Angsi Glacier in Tibet near a sort of pilgrimage spot called Kailash, one of the tallest mountains in the world. It travels through Tibet for I think 2,000 or so kilometers, and then it turns really sharply at this point here in between some of the world's tallest mountains, and then it loses an incredible amount of altitude over just a few hundred, over just 1 or 2 kilometers. It has this incredible tumble down the Himalaya where it gathers even more water in this section down here in northeastern India through monsoonal flows. And then it travels through, so that section of the border is contested. That's where there's Indonesian and Chinese troops contesting the border. It flows through Assam, where it has this incredible propensity to flood. It's an enormous floodplain, and it's also one of the most sediment-rich rivers in the world. That sediment comes from the Indian subcontinent, still crashing up into the Asian continental plate and grating against each other. This tension produces a lot of silt, which ends up in the river, which makes these incredibly fertile floodplains. But also makes it difficult for engineers to control. It's one of the least sort of controlled rivers in the world. But the plans that are being made now for damming this river to produce the green energy that's needed to avoid a climate catastrophe is a particularly dangerous situation. So it then drains out through Bangladesh, and that's what's important here is that the river was always alive in the region's geopolitics. The river and the environmental topography is partly responsible for the construction of it as a borderland, the idea of it as a colonial frontier, the idea of it as difficult to control and as difficult for humans to engineer and sort of build infrastructure around. And that's contributed to it becoming the source of territorial disputes. Once India and China and Bangladeshi states are created, they're partly created on the basis of, sharing water resources, and it makes the river goes through such intense jungle and high altitude spaces that it's taken this long. It's only in the last decade or so that state actors, outside actors, have been able to control it and seek to dominate it. And it's still this incredibly slow, difficult process to develop infrastructure to the contested borders that the river flows through. And that is this enormous engineering challenge that is starting to change, that the Indian and Chinese states, partly based on their border disputes, are starting to have substantial infrastructure builds that are enabling them to build dams in this high altitude areas and the jungle areas of this river. Sorry, I'm just having a little bit of trouble with my slides there. So that points towards this connection between geopolitics and ecology. On the Indian side of the border, road building is incredibly difficult, and it's always slowed by heavy rains and floods because of the monsoon on the Indian side. But those floods are leading the states in the region to want to build dams to control the water flow, to sort of dominate the river itself, and that with that they are estimating that they can generate almost, I think, just in this Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh, they think they can generate something like 50% of India's green energy. This is troop positions all along the line of actual control. The contested border have expanded in recent years. At times of conflicts, water flow data is actually withheld. And as a result, partly of the geopolitical conflict, there is almost no transboundary cooperation between India and China, the two major states that are contesting the river, on as to how to manage the river, how to ensure that the region is environmentally protected. And we're seeing with floods in Assam in the last few months that the enormous difficulty that humans face in sort of trying to tame the river. The question that comes out of this, I think, is it actually possible for human beings to control this river? And this is where the green energy issue comes in. There is a push to do this. There is an attempt to control this river and to use it for the production of green energy. I put green in scare quotes there because in some ways I think this is kind of the anathema of green energy. So, sorry, it wasn't 1/2 of India's electricity. It's 1/3 of the power needed for India's electricity that they think can be generated by hydropower. But the issue here is that will require the construction of a huge number of dams around the state of Arunachal Pradesh. All of those dams have really damaging local ecological consequences. And similarly, there's Chinese dams being planned for this as well. So China has for a long time had plans for a mega dam just on the bend of the river, the section where the river loses all of that altitude over a really short period of time. The plan there is to build a water diversion tunnel under one of the world's tallest mountains called Namcha Bawa, where the river loses 2,000 metres of altitude. So this is a run-of-the-river dam, the idea being that you build a diversion tunnel that takes the water out of the main channel of the river, plunges it underneath the mountain. That can be used to spin turbines to generate green energy. This is part of China's most recent 5-year plan, and this is expected to generate an enormous amount of electricity. This is causing a really strong reaction in India, which is causing the dam and the river to become securitized. Apparently, an access tunnel has already been completed. So this is an incredible engineering feat that the Chinese are attempting, but it does seem like they're making significant progress in terms of making this dam a reality. This requires also dispossessing local communities. So the Indian response to this, India's had these plans for green energy dams on this same river, on their stretch of the river, on the other side of the border. And the plans that China makes to dam the river are causing India's dams to its plans for dams to get larger and larger. So there's been a plan for a site for an Indian dam just near the Chinese border since 2009. And this is quite explicitly securitized by the Indian Environment Minister all the way back in 2009, as you can see from the quote there. The project's been rethought numerous times, and it keeps getting larger and larger in the planning phase as China's own plans accelerate. So you have this competitive dam building process that's going on through the region. This will be a multi-purpose project. The creation of a reservoir will really transform the river's flow, plans for flood moderation, agriculture, as well as electricity. But local Indigenous peoples movements there say that there is a strong chance that this will destroy several of their towns and villages. This will take huge numbers of people off their land. The idea of storing 10 billion cubic meters of water within this reservoir of this dam, this would be one of the largest dams in the world, would risk the deforestation of the area behind that reservoir. It might destroy some of the towns and villages, so it will have enormous ecological consequences for the region. And what this, I think, is doing is risking the creation of a sacrifice zone in the name of green energy. So to wrap up, although there's a power struggle going on, this sort of state-centric water wars narrative approach to the situation contributes to the securitization of the watershed. It makes it more difficult for state actors in the region to cooperate, and it contributes to that dispossession of people who actually live on and near the river. And this leads also to these hyper-scientific understandings of the watershed and the Himalaya more broadly, the Earth more broadly, that tends to lead us to think of people as separate from their environments rather than sort of entangled by them. And that sort of can contribute to the dispossession of people that live in the region. At the same time, the denials that you see of these securitized narratives tend to argue for just more increased cooperation over dams or more dam construction. But I would also note that there are some transboundary bright spots of cooperation, which I think do point something of a way forward. This situation has climate justice issues because the way that minoritized peoples are having their land taken off them or threatened, or the deforestation, the damage done to a river which is really central to the world's ecology, to the monsoonal rains. This geopolitical transformation of the river is really, really damaging to attempts to address climate change, even though it is taking place at the same time as it is being done in the name of green energy. So ultimately what I think will happen here is the river system will undo the geopolitics, or the geopolitics will kill the river. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me, and I will wrap it up and leave it there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Davis. If I may reiterate, in that sense, the Himalaya is somewhat a reflection of what is wrong in many ecological systems that share more than two borders and across emerging nations, but are seriously mismanaged on a policy and perhaps on a political level also. And thinking of it this way, I think we have many instances of this in the ASEAN region as well. So again, hopefully we get to discuss this further later on in our session. Last but not least, I would like to introduce Dr. Sarah Davies, who is unfortunately unable to join us today, but has very kindly recorded her presentation for us. So allow me to introduce Dr. Sarah. Sarah Davies is a professor and research director at the School of Government and International Relations at the Griffith University, Australia. She is the co-founder and co-convener of the Griffith Gender Equality Research Network, a membership of academic and higher degree scholars dedicated to research excellence and in promotion of gender equity. Davies is currently serving as a co-editor-in-chief of the Australian Journal of International Relations. Davies's recent research focuses on global health governance and the women, peace and security, with a particular contribution of advancing feminist methods in the discipline of international relations. Davies's recent publications include Containing Contagion, The Politics of Disease Outbreaks in Southeast Asia, published by Johns Hopkins University in 2019, and Women Are Most Affected by Pandemics, Lessons from Past Outbreaks, published in 2020, with Claire Wenham, Julia Smith, and others. So without further ado, I'd like to invite us all to listen to Dr. Sarah Davies's presentation.
The Global Health Cooperation in response to COVID-19. My name is Sarah Davies. Hello, welcome to my presentation on the Global Health Cooperation in response to COVID-19. My name is Sarah Davies. I'm a professor of international relations at the School of Government and International Relations at Griffith University. And I'm so privileged to be able to speak to you today, and I'm sorry that I'm not able to be with you in person. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I am speaking to you today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Today I'm coming to you from the lands of the Turrbal and Jagera people, and I'm looking out over a beautiful forest landscape right now with the sun shining, and I hope that you're also in a beautiful place. Today I'm going to be talking about the issue of cooperation. And I think a lot of the narrative in which we've understood COVID-19 has been it's been an environment of little cooperation. When we hear the narrative, if we look at that quote from Dr. Tedros, the WHO Director General, back in July 2020, the concern was this lack of leadership, lack of solidarity. This was the threat to facing the pandemic. I'm going to go through international cooperation in 2020 and 2021, and then consider what's the challenges to cooperation now and into the future, and why this narrative of little cooperation has persisted. And is it a fair description of what's happened during COVID-19 pandemic? I think it's important to look at that first month of COVID-19, because what that first month tells us is a story of what was not known and the effort of trying to establish what was known, to erect a response to what was known, and to communicate that knowledge to the world. What we see within the space of 30 days is the mobilization from the first report in Wuhan to the World Health Director General declaring the outbreak a public health emergency of international concern, which meant that under the international health regulations, the agreement to which all member states are under the World Health Assembly, that they would proceed and react to health emergencies, and once recognised, they would agree to WHO recommendations about how they should respond at ports of entry and detection and surveillance of response. This declaration requires states then to adhere to these recommendations. The WHO Director General is now able to issue under this acronym FAIC or FIAC, Public Health Emergency of International Concern. What we see over those 30 days is a number of states, including, the Southeast Asian region, were vital in providing that information of what they were witnessing and sending that information back to the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization was vital in communicating that information to states so that they could prepare and assembling an emergency committee that could decide whether or not this outbreak constituted a fake. It's important to note, and I quote here, an excellent article by Lucia Mullen and the colleagues in the BMJ Global Health, that this decision was reached rather quickly in the case of COVID-19. There were 2 emergency committees. Fake was declared at the second meeting, and it was declared on the basis of not much criteria that usually informs fake declarations. Fake declarations, it is true to say, are not always consistent in terms of the criteria used to reach those decisions, and there's not always a lot of transparency around how these decisions are reached. And these are going to be important questions, I think, moving forward for the international health regulations, if there are any revisions that are made to this instrument. But I think for now, what's important to note on this legacy and question of a failed cooperation, of the inability to be responsive to COVID-19 with solidarity in mind, we need to acknowledge there were definitely gaps in how states responded to that fake. Not all states took that fake seriously and changed their behaviour accordingly. But if we look at the decision itself, I think it's fair to say that we saw some rapidity in terms of that decision, and it was also made on the basis of not the range of knowledge that we usually have in previous declaration situations. It's fair to say, though, that over that first 6 months of COVID-19, there was a serious effort to try and reach a collective understanding of how to respond that continually met hurdles. The effort to try and respond to COVID-19 as a fake was not really leading to dramatic changes in state behaviour. This led to the calls for the declaration of COVID-19 as a pandemic, which happened on the 11th of March. And it's important to know that there wasn't and isn't any clear instrument or process in place for that declaration, which is why we're currently having a lot of discussions about the creation of a pandemic treaty. The World Health Organization, with partners including the World Bank and Gavi and the Global Fund and the European Union, did try to erect some solidarity response funds and pooled technology arrangements in those first 6 months in anticipation of the logistics and supply stresses that would emerge on the global system, which is indeed what happened. We also see an effort to try and introduce some processes through the General Assembly and the World Health Assembly to try and regulate and introduce procedures and consensus around investment in these technology access pool, the CTAP, the Tools Accelerator ACTA, which included COVAX, which would become a really important feature of trying to create a system around vaccine access and sharing across the world. But what we don't see in those first 6 months is the presence of a strong Security Council statement or engagement with the outbreak. We see the Secretary General of the United Nations tending to defer a fair amount of the coordination and the response through the World Health Organization. And the question that has led to is whether or not we think that the World Health Organization was the right organization to be solely, in some instances, managing this outbreak, and were they well adapted to be able to respond to the significance, seriousness of this pandemic as it started to become clear the impact it was having on social, economic, and political systems. In the first 6 months of COVID-19 outbreak, I think what we can ascertain is that the cooperation between states was sometimes minimal. It was sometimes it was selective in terms of the states that would participate in some forums and not others. And this fed into the notion that WHO was in some respects responsible for this failure at cooperation. However, there were attempts to innovate in ways that were quite remarkable and unique, having studied health emergencies in the past. This effort to preempt the logistical and sharing hurdles that we knew had existed in the past was something that was trying to be addressed with COVID-19. But we also saw states very much resort to sovereign first principles, minimal sharing of essential supplies, and serious difficulties trying to get solidarity and consensus on what needed to be the core focus in that first months of COVID-19. Tensions around whether or not it needed to be investigating the origins of the outbreak, whether WHO was the right organisation to be managing it, whether or not the emphasis should be on sharing tool technologies or states devising their own independent instruments. And this was indeed time lost and led to the innovative tools that were developed to not have full support. Over the next 6 months, we see this division that starts to emerge in the first 6 months start to deepen in the next 6 months, where we have the attempts to continue to invest in the ACT-A tools, particularly COVAX, whilst at the same time this sense that COVAX was not going to deliver the types of equitable justice to vaccines that was required. We were going to face serious logistic and supply hurdles and divisions over who had access to the technology and were able to produce the vaccines to supply populations with, health security immediately versus those who would have to wait. There was not always consistent, powerful state investment in COVAX in that last 6 months of 2020, which led to questions about who was going to have to sign up to the COVAX scheme and wait for their vaccines versus who were going to be able to seek access to vaccines outside of these types of requirements. This led to the governments of India and South Africa proposing the need for a waiver for all of the medical needs associated with COVID-19 and serious opposition from a number of the states who, of course, were vital in maintaining their intellectual property rights. So at the end of the first year of COVID-19, what we see is rapid investment in a vaccine solution, but it's going to not necessarily be equitably delivered. And states are having to face the option of cooperating in a scheme that was not going to lead to delivery of vaccines in the same time frame as some other high-income countries. And you see countries starting to depart from COVAX and seeking their own bilateral deals in this instance. We also see that SARS-CoV-2 is starting to produce new strains. And in 2021, that's going to have an enormous economic, social, and political toll on countries that had already experienced these tolls in 2020. At the third point in the international scene, there was also going to be this emerging conversation around a new instrument required to respond to future outbreaks, as well as emphasis on WHO organising an independent expert panel visit to China to investigate the origins of SARS-CoV-2. So at the end of the first year of 2020, you have cooperation emerging, but different points of emphasis and focus. And I think it's worth all of you reflecting, listening to me now. I'd be keen to know your feedback on whether or not you think a dramatic turning point in 2020 would have been if we'd been able to secure that intellectual property waiver on the COVID-19 vaccines and other medical tools required to respond to that pandemic. In 2021, between January and July, what we see here is an effort with a change of government in the United States to try and re-galvanize COVAX again. We see China and the US engaging a lot more in terms of vaccine delivery and distribution. We also see India becoming a crucial partner here and committing to produce 1.1 billion vaccines under COVAX. But we also see at the same time the United Nations Security Council resolution, now its second resolution, calling for vaccine sharing, but that not necessarily leading to clear understanding of where that solidarity should be placed, who should be coordinating it outside of who and its partners. And the Security Council, in essence, at this point, is still not really able to actively mobilise a sense of direction for the rest of the international community. So there's still a heavy reliance on the General Assembly and the World Health Assembly to be coordinating and managing this. This leads to, in May, the independent panel report being released, which talks about the problems of the architecture in relation to global health security, and arguing that the General Assembly, nor the World Health Assembly, nor the Security Council are really adequate venues for dealing with the type of coordination and prioritisation required in something like a COVID-19 pandemic. And them arguing for the creation of a Global Health Threats Council, as well as the concerted effort in a pandemic treaty. This leads to the World Health Assembly agreeing the next day to create a member state working group on strengthening WHO preparedness and response to health emergencies, to focus in particular on strengthening the international health regulations, as well as discussing a pandemic treaty, which would lead to a special working group being held and a special session of the World Health Assembly in November and December 2021. But again, what we're not seeing at this point in the middle of 2021 is this real, clear, consistent consensus across the international community on what the pandemic treaty should look like, how it will assist with a COVAX scheme that is struggling to make inroads, on top of a situation now where we have India, one of the key states dependent upon to realise the COVAX deal, halting their exports of vaccines due to the extreme Delta wave that they started to experience in March. The G7 meets in June 2021 and releases this Carbis Bay Health Declaration, which talks about a vaccine pledge, IHR compliance, and 100 days to respond to FAIX. But what we don't necessarily see from that is a consistent understanding of how that G7 consensus can be spread across the 190 plus states to achieve some sort of inroads. In the last 6 months of 2021, what we're starting to see is the targets that were created in the first half of the year are not being met. The vaccine distribution is becoming more inequitable. Countries' commitments financially to the COVAX, as well as vaccine distributions and supply of vaccines, is not being met. And we're also seeing continued resistance to the TRIPS waiver at the World Trade Organization. It's in this environment that the World Health Assembly has its special session in November and December 21. And what we see here is a decision to establish an intergovernmental negotiating body to draft and negotiate a WHO convention or agreement or other type of international instrument on pandemic prevention, preparedness and response. But the outcome would not be presented to the World Health Assembly until 2024. What we do see is also consistence, and you see this in the statements that are read out in that special session, around the need to strengthen the IHR. And that's going to be prioritised or recommended as a priority for the 2022 World Health Assembly. So at the end of 2 years of the pandemic in 2022, where are we standing? We see no agreement on the TRIPS waiver for vaccines. We see a pandemic accord under discussion, but not going to affect any change for the COVID-19 response. We see support for revisions to the international health regulations that are to be determined. We're starting to see, I think crucially, discussions around a new fund for pandemic prevention, preparedness and response, which would become the Financial Intermediary Fund, which has just been announced this month. And that is a first, if you like, for a health emergency space. And then we're also seeing at this UN General Assembly this year a high-level meeting on pandemic preparedness and response governance. But what we're also seeing is a group of states that have mixed understanding and response to all of these different types of international cooperation movements that are happening at the same time. The working group released a survey that had sought to collect responses from member states on what they wanted in terms of the mechanism for implementation of a pandemic preparedness and response treaty or agreement. And what we see here actually, out of the very small percent rate, only 8% of response rate, 24%, is that the majority of our states that completed that survey really want there to be emphasis on the existing frameworks that we have. Instruments such as the international health regulations, arguably the treaty, the TRIPS agreement, are the ones that need to be amended rather than necessarily creating new instruments. Not particularly high support for the creation of new instruments. So I think what we need to consider in all of this at the moment is that the creation of more and more and more agreements and frameworks isn't necessarily going to overcome the cooperation challenges that we have. The cooperation challenges that we have is a consensus and an alignment on understanding what are the issues of inequity, of injustice, and what can be done to overcome those that are rubbing up against the geopolitical realities and divisions that were there before COVID-19, but have definitely deepened during. So we need to go into this next phase of the COVID-19 recovery with a really clear understanding, I think, around the limitations, but also where there is perhaps consensus. I think in terms of the WHO Pandemic Treaty, what really needs to be understood or perhaps thought about more is that the IHR revisions does have majority consensus. So prioritising amendments there and strengthening those regulations may be the first step then towards being able to understand what the pandemic treaty needs to focus on and guarantee and seek states' commitment and guarantee. Because this is a treaty that will only be strong if it's got the majority of states participating in it. In terms of TRIPS, then perhaps needs to be a recognition and more concerted effort in the international space to recognising that even if the TRIPS agreement is secured, the TRIPS waiver is secured, it's only going to be specific to COVID-19. There is a deeper inequity and injustice occurring here with intellectual property that really does need to be addressed, perhaps outside of even COVID, because as some are starting to argue, the waiver even for COVID-19 is not going to address this endemic insecurity. And what we're seeing here now is partnerships and alliances that are starting to happen at the regional level because of this sense that TRIPS and the WTO is not going to deliver the justice and security that is needed. There is significant cooperation around the financing and indeed a desire for this financing facility that's been created by the World Bank with association with the World Health Organization to work. But we also need to face the fact that it is going to be under immense stress when it's placed within a context of all the other types of demands and competition for donor funds at the moment. So the dedication of thinking and practice to how pandemic prevention and planning can be embedded with other existing social, political and economic inequalities in societies is going to be perhaps the best pathway towards preparedness and recovery. We're in a situation where the donor funds may actually be starting to diminish. So thinking really strategically about how these financing facilities can secure the types of health system strengthening that will benefit populations at risk, populations who could be neglected during pandemics and emergencies, as well as strengthen the type of national level detection and response measures really needs to be a priority going forward. We also have a story of human rights in COVID-19 that to a large extent has been neglected. Human rights has been largely told through the stories of equity and justice around the area of vaccine and also the impacts of the lockdowns. But I also think, too, that there's a story that we need to tell here about what we think is acceptable in terms of civil liberties and freedoms during future pandemics. who is best placed to operationalise public health interventions, and what type of society do we want to strengthen during a pandemic and in its aftermath. Civil society has played a tremendously important role in a number of situations where they have, prior to the outbreak, not always been given the support and recognition that they need, particularly in health emergency response. And I think they're right to exist, and supporting them as being part of the financial facility and even part of the types of national action planning for pandemics preparedness needs to be seriously considered. Beyond 2022, what I think we need to be thinking about and prioritising is the inequity of the COVID-19 and the consequence that it's had for populations in terms of the fact that the Human Development Index has dropped for 90% of countries. We've got record number of people who depended on social welfare support, but less than a quarter were gender sensitive. That's going to have a generational impact now. And we've also got a situation where a number of countries have made significant losses in areas such as vaccination coverage gaps. So again, thinking about important introductions like that financial facility, thinking about this relationship between pandemic preparedness and response and addressing the losses that have been created due to the COVID-19 pandemic is a really important area of cooperation that needs to be happening. There's also a situation where the technology has not delivered equity for everyone. We've got populations now around the world that are vaccinated perhaps with an effective vaccine, or vaccinated with partially effective vaccine, or some citizens that are not vaccinated at all. COVID-19 is not yet over for a large number of populations. What does this mean in terms of cooperation at the international level? I think what it means is that we've seen now that health can be a site, yes, of innovation, if we think about the ACT-A and Accelerator, but it can also be a site of inequity and injustice. The idea that health can be a neutral space where diplomacy can be secured, I think has been challenged in the last 2 years. It's important to continue to promote health and global health architecture and global health financing, but it also needs to be with a recognition that this too is a space that is not neutral. It does have the potential to create tensions, to be exploited, and there is a need for us to be in recognition of the fact that those scientific partnerships and those bilateral arrangements could mean that health sometimes is going to be a site where there could be intense diplomacy and a lack of cooperation. I think that one of the solutions here is to recognise that regional diplomacy really matters here, and to be able to make sure that in discussions like the IHR revisions, the financial facility, as well as the pandemic treaty, to be having conversations about regional representation and regional engagement with these international arrangements, so that we're taking into account the fact that international cooperation is informed and embedded in the way in which different regions realise and think about the way in which they achieve and pursue their security. But there also are lessons to be learnt here, I think, about the challenges to our current international architecture in the areas of something like a pandemic, where we're requiring governments to overcome and cooperate in a situation where they're under immense domestic pressure and having to manage different types of governance and scientific arrangements. The pandemic treaty may be a solution towards trying to overcome those limits, where we can pursue perhaps a universal or collective understanding of what should be the priority for solidarity in the next outbreak that we will face. So I think COVID-19 definitely fractured our faith in international cooperation, but it did not destroy it. We saw really important attempts here at innovation. We saw really important individual and collective leadership, if we think about the governments of South Africa and India with the TRIPS waiver, of the role that Indonesia is playing with the discussions around the working group and the pandemic treaty. The importance of these is to look at what led to their inability sometimes, particularly in the areas of COVAX and TRIPS, to achieve the type of success that was hoped for them, to learn from those challenges and to think about what can be done going forward. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful conference, and I look forward to your engagement.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, this video marks the end of the presentation session. I'd like to now move on to the question and answer session where we invite you to engage our panelists and the topics that they have presented today. I see we already have questions coming in from the audience joining us from Zoom. I would like to start with Pak Nuruddin, who I think has a few questions for Dr. Davis. I'd like to invite Pak Nuruddin to address your questions in person, if this is okay. Silakan, Pak.
Yes, thank you, Mrs. Yulida. I have three questions to Dr. Davis. Yeah. My first question is related to the development of dam mega project in Himalaya. I wonder, this development in Himalaya will also have implication for the melting of ice in Himalaya. What do you think, Doctor, about the dam project in Himalaya? Does it have implication for the melting of ice? If this the case, will this problem not drag many more actors in Himalaya, not only India and China, maybe international actor, America, Soviet, and many more, if the dam will have implication of the melting of ice? That's my first question. My second question is about I think the environmental logic is based on the idea of connectivity, and this logic is contradict the post-colonial colonial border logic that divide river arbitrarily. And my question is, what is the perspective of local Himalaya people or local Himalaya community regarding the river and dam? Do they affirm the logic of river and mountain more than the logic of post-colonial border? I don't know. Maybe you can explain it more. And my last question about, do you agree with Bruno Latour idea to include Atan in this case, like river, mountain, in addition to conventional actor like the state, China, India, as an important part in reconstructing IR studies related to climate justice? Maybe that's all my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Nuruddin. Dr. Davis, because we have three questions, perhaps you'd like to address them.
Yes, of course. These are really good questions, Nuruddin. Thank you very much. So I'll start with do I think of rivers and mountains as actors question? Very quickly, yes, I do. I think that helps us to understand the role that the earth and ecosystems have in politics. That if we think of them as having an unusual kind of form of agency, then that forces us to engage with them more, it forces us to understand them more, and it really helps to transform, it helps to disrupt the sort of state as actor notion in international relations, which I think is really valuable, and I think it gives us a much deeper understanding of this region in particular, but I would suspect that holds for other regions, and I'd be really interested to hear how that works in ASEAN, if that's in Southeast Asia, if that's part of the discussion. Will mega dams melt more ice? That is, so they will, but not necessarily directly. So a large dam will have a massive reservoir that can sort of back up the river and cause floods. It dispossesses people, but they're not all. Some of them are at the high peaks where there is substantial ice, and that can be damaging. The ones that I was talking about, they'll have indirect effects on the ice pack. So what the issue there is not necessarily the dam, but the people required to operate and staff the dam. So having a dam at high altitude requires trucks, it requires security forces, they're quite often connected to the army, and all of that produces localized carbon emissions. And the issue there is that those localized carbon emissions can form something called black carbon, basically soot. And if a lot of that is emitted locally, it can blow onto ice caps and cause accelerated warming. So it's pretty sort of fairly intuitive ecological process where basically once ice is covered in soot, and I've seen like sooty glaciers and ice caps in the Himalaya, once they're covered in soot, the color black sucks in heat instead of sort of clean white ice reflecting heat. So that causes accelerated warming, and that it's not necessarily just the dam, but the increased human activity. But I think ultimately the localized warming is more caused by the army and the conflict, having large numbers of people on ice and glaciers, and the borders were drawn specifically to be at the highest peak of a mountain. Colonial border drawers thought that the natural place to draw a mountain border was along the ridgeline, and that means that you have large army presences permanently stationed on ice caps, and that expanded with the India-China conflict in 2020. So dams are a part of this, but the broader situation is causing accelerated ice melting. Does that mean other international actors should be engaged? I personally prefer the idea of bottom-up solutions rather than top-down solutions. I think external actors played such an important role in the construction of these border conflicts that it would be better if they weren't too closely involved. I think we're too responsible for them. But there are international organisations that work in the region that are quite effective. So there's an institution called ICIMOD that is based in Kathmandu that circulates ecological knowledge and solutions around the region. So there are international actors engaged, but all states engaged in the region are reluctant to have the US or the UN or Australia, Canada, external Western actors come in and moderate the border disputes. But as I said, I think it's better to have bottom-up rather than top-down solutions to this. And that leads neatly to your last question, how do local people feel about this? It's really difficult to generalise about that question. It's kind of hard to understate how diverse the region is, and it's not really possible to generalise. So it does depend, though. It's really complicated majority-minority politics going on in the region. So there are some really fervent anti-dam movements that are focused on preventing dam construction in northeastern India. And then there are some people, but there's some of those people also still want the military presence there because they don't want to be part of China or they don't want to be part of Pakistan. So it's incredibly complicated. There are just to emphasize, there are strong sort of ecologically centered protest movements in the region, but there's also plenty of people who want dams, who want material development. So it's really split and divisive question. I hope that answers all of your questions. I'll leave it there and pass it back over to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dennis and Pak Nuruddin. Any follow-up questions, Pak Nuruddin?
No, I think it's clear. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to again invite you to use the raise hand feature to address your questions directly to our panelists. Or if more convenient, you may also use the comment box for me to read out. If you are joining us from YouTube, you may also use the comment section, and our committee will help to relay. As Chair, I'd like to take the liberty to address Pak Riza while we wait for more questions and comments. Pak Riza, understanding the tension between the global North and South, in your opinion, what does the future of leadership of the South look like for the next chairs of G20, in this case India and then Brazil, who also happen to represent the global South?
Okay, thank you, Ida. One of the key features of the G20 leadership is the so-called Troika scheme. The Troika scheme has been established since its birth in 1999 and had been discussed as a way to ensure the sustainability, the continuations of any ideas, any initiative that had been put by leaders or leadership or presidencies. And responding to your questions with regards to especially digital economy, then what we could expect from the Troika scheme is that, first of all, the platforms of the Digital Economy Working Group would be the one that be the focus of any norm-setting arrangement. But also we also hope that it goes beyond just a norm-setting forum, but also regulatory frameworks arrangement. We know that the G20 is a non-binding institution, non-binding forum, but judging from the previous experiences of scores of working groups, many national or domestic regulatory frameworks would also go in line with the agreements, with the communique or policy frameworks that have been introduced in the G20 forum. The one that in this context, in the working groups here. And for digital economy, I would assume that the three priority issues that have been put in place by the Indonesian presidency would be the one that will be delivered, will be deliverables that will be continued and assessed more deeply by the next presidencies of India and also Brazil. And we hope from that we could then imagine a not only decentralized norm-setting situation, but also cooperative or even a hegemonic one, where I think the Global South could be the driver. We could be in the driving seat of having this forum to be projected in the next 2 years. Thank you, Dida.
Thank you very much, Pak Riza. I see a raised hand from Dr. Munira. Dr. Munira, I kindly invite you to address your questions, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry, I actually stayed on, but I found it very interesting. My question, my question is for both Alex and Riza, both of you. Alex, I liked your point about considering the topography as an actor. I mean, this is my point about an indigenous approach to theorizing about the basics of international theory and how we relate. Now, I was thinking about Southeast Asia and the disputed sea areas and using the sea as an agent. How would that figure in? Now, maybe this is where it applies. My question applies to Riza as well. How does it fit in when you have laws such as well, you have SLOC and you have the EEZ, and then now you have a belligerent China declaring the 9-dash line. How do you incorporate the sea as an actor in your argument against what the law is about, what the law says? Okay, I know there may not be an answer to this, but it's something that we need to consider, keep thinking about, because this is a different approach that we need to take in IR. Because if anything, we need to find solutions to the persistent conflicts that we're having. Okay, that's all. Enjoy trying to answer. Thank you.
That's a very difficult and excellent question. I'm not. I don't think that much about the South China Sea disputes as perhaps as I should, or as much as my other colleagues here. In Australia and IR academics spend a lot of time thinking about the South China Sea and what that means for regional order. So I can answer how I theorize that way with the rivers that I'm particularly interested in, and then maybe we can have a discussion about how that might relate to the ocean or the seas themselves. So the issue was the idea that the Earth is an agent in the geopolitics as a backdrop, right? That's the core sort of provocation that comes out of some green IR theorizing, and also a lot of indigenous philosophies around the world, and that can lead to sort of indigenous theorizing about international relations. I think all of those things are nicely connected. So the rivers are an agent in Asian geopolitics because of the way that they traverse borders, the way that they flood. Sometimes this is really, really direct, right? So rivers are used as borders, but rivers move. There was a case in Nepal a couple of years ago where I think there was an earthquake, and a river that was used as a border changed its flow, and it technically meant that a village went from Nepal to India. So that can be really directly obvious, right? That the way that the ocean currents work, or the way that a river flows, or a lot of the borders in the region are ice caps. Ice caps rise and recede with seasons, right? In summer they shrink, and in winter they get bigger when more snow falls on them. So they're quite dynamic. But by transcending the borders in the region, so took it back to the Brahmaputra, the river is so difficult to control and live next to that it was difficult for external actors to permanently stay there, to permanently settle the region. It was difficult for the Raj or for the Chinese Qing Empire to settle in the region. That's partly because of the jungle, it's partly because of the altitude, but it's also partly because the river floods so much and is so kind of unruly. So because of that, the river played a role in the construction of the region as a borderland. It played a role in the construction of the border conflicts, and that means that the border didn't just happen to appear where the river was. The river was part of the process of it becoming a borderland. And I think that means it's really helpful to think of the Earth or the ecology or the river system as an agent in the geopolitical conflict, and it's probably the most powerful one, if you conceive of it that way. So I don't know enough about the South China Sea to really address your question. I'm almost tempted to throw that back at you. How do you think the South China Sea itself, that ecosystem, has played a role in the conflict? Is it through its fish stocks, through its animals? Is it through its resources? Is it through the way that histories and cultures have been projected onto the sea? Those are all probably possibilities. And then you could also draw in the fact that oceans are rising. How is that situation? How is the possibility of flooding or oceanic transformations or ocean currents changing? How is that will that play a role in shaping the South China Sea disputes? Those would be the questions I'd look at. I don't know if I can answer your question any more directly, but those are my thoughts.
Maybe Riza, you can chip in, and then maybe I'll get back to if the moderator is okay about me saying something.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Munira. I will try my best to respond to your questions by, first of all, citing that the question would really relate to the area of maritime dispute and how the countries in Southeast Asia deal with that, especially in the coming of China in the South China Sea. I would see from two different angles, Professor, on that. First of all, we should, I think, look at the dispute not only territorial ones, but also geoeconomically speaking, is a natural resources dispute. And that includes two broad areas. The first one relates to mining, deep sea mining, and to the fact that it will be probably the next areas of disputes in energy transitions. But also the second one is fishery. On the mining, I think what happens in South China Sea is something that is not been explored very deeply by disputed countries, by the claimants of the countries. They really focus more on territorial dispute. In fact, when we talk about dispute settlement, we need to go beyond just positions, but also to the interest, the hidden interest of the positions. The 9-dash line, yes, it's probably territorial claims, but beneath that is the interest, the economic interest, and we should then see them geo-economically. And then how the ASEAN centrality, this is my second point, ASEAN centrality goes to that. And I think when we look back at the history of ASEAN involvement in South China Sea dispute, we really keen to have this workshop on South China Sea. But the focus is merely on the high-profile issue, the high politics issue, the realist issue, but not not yet going to the low-profile, low-context issue such as the fishery or even the energy, or even when we talk about fishery, then we also talk about the possible threat of illegal fishing, unregulated fishing. That's the one that ASEAN need to be really concerned about in the next steps of dispute settlements on these specific areas of, especially South China Sea. But I happen to also supervise a doctoral candidate writing something on Ambalat, Professor Munira, how the two countries, Malaysia and Indonesia, now establishing a very technical details on how to negotiate on Ambalat issue. And it works well. In this technical level, both countries have experts who deal with technical issues. They deal with also GPS. They even deal with utilizing digital data to sort of like spot the common grounds of the two countries. And I think that's also something that we IR scholars need to be also deal with. The one that you talk about, the interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary nature of our study. And by the way, I like your presentations, Alex. I really enjoy that. In addition to the inspiring speech by Professor Munira previously. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Munira, any follow-up comments?
Okay, just very quickly, thank you for giving me the time. Yeah, thank you, Riza, and both you and Alex. I guess I was looking or zoning in on what Alex said about the bottom-up approach. And now that you mentioned, Riza, about the technical solutions that are in place now, that is acceptable and that's good. But also going back to my talk earlier about ethics, I was wondering, and then including the interdisciplinary approach, including the aspects of the human security aspects, and that connects with the fisheries problem. What about fishermen and the families who live on the ocean? There are many of these families whose culture and being are shaped by the ocean. That is going to be wiped out because we have competing powers who want raw materials, who want minerals. But basically, all these cultures are about is how to fish and how to feed themselves. So this is the ethics of it, and how arguments connected with that have to infiltrate the realist approach that IR takes. So that's my comment, and that's my hope. You know, it sounds like a tall order, but we need to incorporate these kinds of arguments. I know human security is already there, but anthropology can come in because culture is built on these seas. You know, how these communities have survived for centuries, for millennia when it comes to Southeast Asia. Maybe we can bring that in as part of the canon. Okay, thank you and so much for allowing me to say a few words. Thank you.
By all means. Thank you very much, Dr. Munira. Ladies and gentlemen, do we have any more questions for our panelists today? I see a question from an audience from joining us from Zoom, if I'm not mistaken. I see a list of comments and a question from Pak Sahrial Fazri. Perhaps I will take the liberty to select one of these comments or questions, particularly regarding climate. Let me quickly take a look. So, how serious and committed are the G20 countries in dealing with the climate crisis? And is this a part of economic priority for these countries? I think this question can be addressed to both, but I also see a hand raised from Pak Aim. I will entertain Pak Lukman Hakim. Silahkan.
Okay, thanks, Ms. Julida. First, I would like to thank Alex for a wonderful presentations. I just can imagine, you know, the method, the fieldwork, the energy you spend to produce such a wonderful finding. First, I would like to echo what Munira said about the importance, and I think your research could be a good exemplar on how to produce, the knowledge of IR from the conditions, experiences of the global South. And my question is, I would like to extrapolate the finding into the theorizations of IR, and perhaps the knowledge you produce have resulted into what other scholars said, pluralizations of IR, which is, I think, the important conditions for a non-Western IR to emerge. And my question is that, one of the prerequisites to to allow this particularity of knowledge is, of course, to disarticulate Eurocentrism's model of IR. And in your opinion, to what extent such, sorry to say, like narrow and focused productions of IR, like in your case, which is highly case-based, can contribute to the disarticulations of, Eurocentrism's based IR. And the second questions should be addressed to Mas Riza because Sarah Davis is not here. But the basic issues is that, the pandemic and digital transformations have similar natures and a similar paradox. Both issues actually normatively urge us to build the solidarity, because we believe pandemic need more cooperations, and digital transformations would be impossible without without cooperations as well. But the problem here is that in the issues of pandemic, the prospect of multilateralisms, liberal multilateralisms, I would say, had been hindered by the phenomenon of, cases like vaccine nationalism, for example, that hampered, people to get vaccines equally at the global level. And in the case of digital transformations, especially what have we witnessed in G20, how geopolitical issues have blocked this possibility of open collaborations in the framework of multilateralism. Do you think that this is the end of multilateralisms or the end of liberal model of multilateralism? Thank you.
Sorry, thank you very much, Pak Aim, for these questions. I'd like to invite Dr. Davis to answer first.
Thank you very much for both questions. Sorry, I was still just thinking about them, but I'll try to think on the run. So to start with the question from the chat, how serious are G20 countries in dealing with climate change? So I think if you look at the COP process and the changes that have happened in that since the Paris Agreement, you'll find that most of the G20 countries are serious about dealing with climate change. Not necessarily all of them. I don't think Russia is particularly serious about dealing with climate change. I don't think Brazil under Bolsonaro is particularly serious about dealing with climate change. I don't think the US under Trump was at all serious about dealing with climate change. But for the most part, there has been in the last few years a shift from debating the science of climate change to accepting it and figuring out how to deal with it. But the issue there is that we've spent far too long debating the reality of it, and now the deadline is upon us, and where the world is kind of like one of my students waking up the morning that their essay is due and trying to do a good job of it, right? That it's going to be very rushed. We're trying to do this too quickly, and that's why ideas like massive hydropower dams that are really destructive to local environments are being taken seriously as green energy, because the cost benefit, we've waited so long that the cost benefit analysis has shifted, and now they're seen as a positive because they can create power and development, but they'll have disastrous local consequences, and the long-term consequences can be really serious. So I think G20 countries are serious about it, but they're still not doing a particularly good job of dealing with it. That's how I would answer that question, but I'd be really keen to hear Riza's thoughts on it as well. To what extent does case-based work sort of diffuse or challenge Eurocentrism in international relations? I really like this question. It's a good topic. So I think one of the keys to dealing with Eurocentrism is bringing in non-Western voices, and we just need a plural, as many as possible, as can be brought into the discipline, can be put into dialogue with the discipline, as many different perspectives as possible. There are risks with it, though, that if it engages deeply with non-Western perspectives, I think it challenges Eurocentrism. But you also have to look beyond dominant nationalities and identities. So what I don't like particularly is this push to find like a Chinese IR or an Indian IR or a Brazilian IR or a South African IR, right? That's important, but you have to look beyond those dominant nationalities, or you'll just create another hierarchical perspective. So engaging with Indigenous voices from Australia or from the Himalaya, or minorities' experiences of international affairs, the perspective that borderland peoples have on international affairs. That's all necessary too. If we just do the sort of nation-state-based Chinese or Indian take on IR, then I think that's a really limited challenge to Eurocentrism. But detailed case study-based work where you develop a real affinity for the region and really properly engage with that perspective, I do think that is a key part of challenging Eurocentrism. And also, Munira, I think that's a wonderful idea for a research project. We really need to experiment, because the old models don't work. So we need to be creative and try things, and maybe not everything will work. But that sounds like a fantastic project. Best of luck with it. I'll pass over to Riza now. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Pak Riza, your take on the two questions on climate change, as well as the future for liberal multilateralism.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dida. And thank you very much for the question, Mas Aim, and also for somebody who wrote in the chat box here. I think it's Sahrial. Sahrial, thank you for the question. Let me first address Mas Aim's questions on whether the current phenomenon of digital transformation or the pandemics, which which influenced by the rising of protectionism, nationalism, could be the end of liberal multilateralism. I would say no. In fact, this is the beginning of the international community to redefine the so-called multilateralism. And the ethics that Dr. Munira mentioned about could be the foundations of these redefinitions of multilateralism. I would offer two examples. The first one is on fishery. The latest ministerial meeting of WTO in Geneva happened to agree in fishery subsidy agreement. And the notion that they agree is that the one that based on ethics, that based on the acceptance of climate change impacts of the fate of the fishermen that living in the ocean that mentioned by Dr. Munira. But the fact that the agreement of fishery subsidy has been engaged by the leaders of WTO shows that the norms has been there at the multilateral level. And that's the first example. The second one is the G20 itself. And with that, I will also address the first question on whether the G20 is serious about tackling climate change issues. In this regards, I share a lot with Alexis' opinion on that in terms of seriousness they are very serious. They are very serious in setting the norms. They are establishing so many working groups related to dealing with climate change, ranging from development, environment, including the one that we have been involved, the digital economy. We also talk about the linkage between digital economy and also energy, but also climate change. In this regard, they are very serious in norm setting as a norm setting forum. But as also Alex mentioned, the problem is that when they try to cascade the norms, when they try to internalize the norms domestically or regionally speaking, domestically speaking or regionally speaking, we have problems. And I think IR theorization need to tackle this with two broad approach. The first one, of course, really depends on how we redefine the legacy of realist point of view, the top-down approach to that, the regime theorization. We need to, I think, to closely, updates our information on how the regime theory that was started in 1970s, 1980s, suitable for the one that we have nowadays. And secondly, the bottom-up approach that Alex has showed us here, very, very interestingly, and how then the transdisciplinary nature of IR should be put there. And ethics, again, would be the basic of our understanding of this bottom-up approach. And with the coming of new norms, including the one in the G20, I really believe that we are serious on that, but we have problems in defining the legal frameworks, or in terms of geoeconomy, the ecosystems, the ecosystems of the economy. We have problems of that. So that probably the one that we need to collaborate more among ourselves as IR scholars, and I really look forward to having collaboration with you all. Thank you very much, Tida. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Pak Riza, Dr. Davis. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid this is all the time that we have for today. To conclude our discussions, allow me to very briefly summarize two takeaways from today's discussion. Firstly, in mitigating the North-South divide, what is urgently required is a heightened diplomatic role of emerging nations combined with sound strategies to address tensions and potential tensions. And secondly, it is also time for the academia to play a more central role in this debate, in shaping talks of ethics, morale, in sharpening strategies, and also reiterating our alignment with humanity as a whole. Dr. Riza, Dr. Davis, Dr. Davies, on behalf of the organizing committee, thank you very much for your participation in our event. The discussions have been extremely insightful, and we hope to engage you in more talks in there. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much once again, and please join us again tomorrow for our panel discussions. Over to you, Karis.
Thank you. Kasih aja ini apa? Kasih video aja. Oh sorry, lupa.
Kasih real. Oke.
Ladies and gentlemen, apologies. That was the end of the discussion today. We look forward to rejoining in our session tomorrow. And with this, I end our conference for today. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, Dida.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Alex.
See you
Looking
later.
forward to
Thanks,
seeing you soon.
Yeah, I'll hope to meet you soon. That would be wonderful. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.